subscribe. Click on the bell. Like, comment.
Chapter 8 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt, Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 8 Flight. Can there be a more dreary solitude to a mind writhing under the throes of some new and hidden sorrow than a brilliant ballroom? The stirring music jars like the harshest discord upon the untuned ear. The glaring lights dazzle the pained vision until utter darkness would seem grateful. The merry voices and careless laughter catch a tone of bitter mockery. The gaily apparelled forms, the faces decked with soulless smiles, are more oppressive than all the apparitions a fevered imagination can people the gloomiest seclusion. Maurice soon found the festive scene at Château de Tremaison intolerable, and took refuge in the illuminated conservatory, the doors of which were thrown invitingly open. It was midsummer, but the flowers had been restored to brighten their winter shelter during the fête. He thought to find himself alone, but yonder, bending over richly tinted clusters of azaleas and odorous heliotropes, a group of youthful heads unconcernedly thrust their lifeless chaplets in challenging contrast with nature's living loveliness, while flowing robes recklessly swept their floral imitations against her shrinking originals. In a different state of mind, Maurice might not have been struck by the incongruous contact of the painted semblance with the blushing reality, but now it reminded him too keenly that the sphere within which he was bound, a social ixion upon the petty wheel of conventionalism, was one grand combination of artificial trivialities and senseless shams. Goaded beyond endurance by the reflection, he impatiently made his escape into the open air. Bertha had never mingled with a gay crowd in so joyless a mood. The presence of the heiress created no little sensation, but good breeding kept its manifestation within such delicate limits that she was unconscious of its existence. She was not even aware that it was a sign of her own importance when the Marchioness de Fleury glided up to Count Tristan, on whose arm Bertha was leaning, and, in a softly cadenced voice, asked if she had not the pleasure of seeing Mademoiselle de Merivale. In reply, the Count presented Bertha. As she returned the courtesy of the Marchioness, she could not help remembering the declaration of Maurice that he had never perused the countenance of the distinguished belle, because his attention was irresistibly riveted upon the wondrous details of her toilette. For Bertha found her own eyes involuntarily wandering over the graceful folds of the amethyst velvet and the exquisite disposition of the point de Venise by which it was elaborately ornamented, the artistic headdress in perfect accordance with the costly robe, and the Cleopatra-like drops of pearls which seemed to have been showered over the wearer from brow to foot. Bertha's eyes were too ingenious not to betray their occupation, but those of the Marchioness seemed only to be looking with the most complimentary expression of interest into the face of her new acquaintance, while in reality she was scanning Bertha's picturesque attire and longing to discover by what tasteful fingers it had been contrived, examining the polished ivy intertwining among her bright ringlets, and the half-blown roses just bursting their sheaths in such a glossy covert of amber tresses, and wondering that a coiffure with such poetic taste could have existed unknown in Brittany. As the Marchioness stood, dropping sweet, meaningless words from her dewy lips, Bertha's hand was claimed by the Duc de Montauban, and she was led to the dance. She was moving through the quadrille with a languid, unelastic motion, very unlike her usual springing step, when she caught sight of Monsieur de Bois, standing at a short distance, with his face turned towards her. The smile that accompanied her bow of greeting drew him nearer. As the dance ended, and her partner was reconducting her to the countess, Monsieur de Bois overcame his timidity sufficiently to join her. "Where is Mademoiselle Madelaine?" he inquired. "I have not seen her." "She is not here. She would not come," sighed Bertha, stopping abruptly, though they had not quite reached her chaperone's side. "Is she ill? She told me this morning that she would certainly be here. Has anything happened?" asked Monsieur de Bois, speaking as distinctly as though he had never stammered in his life, and throwing off, in his growing excitement, all the awkwardness of his constitutional diffidence. Bertha could not but remark his anxious expression, and a suspicion, which she had essayed to banish, once more took possession of her mind. But she loved Madelaine with such an absolute devotion, but this vague, uncomfortable sensation was quickly displaced by a purer emotion. Glancing at the countess to see that she was not within hearing distance, she disengaged her arm from that of the Duke with a bow which he interpreted into a dismissal, and then, turning eagerly to Monsieur de Bois, recounted to him in a low, hurried tone the occurrences of the morning. She fancied she heard words which sounded very much like muttered imprecations. He was perhaps putting into practice his new method of loosening his tongue, and doubtless imagined that the emphatic utterances were inaudible. Bertha went on. "It was a terrible blow to Maurice. He felt so sure until then that Madelaine loved him. So did I, but we were both mistaken. It is plain enough now that she does not." "What makes it plain? How can you be sure?" asked Monsieur de Bois, becoming more and more disturbed. "Her own declaration has placed the fact beyond doubt. She even confessed that she loved another." Her listener did not attempt to conceal his consternation at these words. "Mademoiselle Madelaine said she loved another? She, who would not stoop to breathe a word which was not the strictest truth. She told you so? You heard it yourself? You are certain, very certain, Mademoiselle Bertha?" "I dare say that I ought not to have repeated this to you," replied Bertha, who now experienced some self-reproach at betraying her friend's secret to one whom it, perhaps, so deeply concerned. "But I am very certain that Madelaine distinctly rejected Maurice, and when he attributed her refusal to his grandmother's and his father's disapproval of his suit, she denied that she was influenced by them, and confessed that her heart was not free, that she had bestowed it upon another." "By all that is heroic, she is a noble woman!" exclaimed Monsieur de Bois fervently. "She has the grandest nature. She is "Comparable," said Bertha, finishing his sentence, and checking a sigh. "Yes, I have never known anyone like her. She has no equal."
"I don't exactly say that. I don't mean that. She is not superior to..."
Bertha did not assist him by completing this disjointed phrase, even if she suspected what he desired to say. At that moment Count Damoreau approached, accompanied by a gaunt, overdressed lady with harsh and forbidding features.
"Lady Vivian is looking for Mademoiselle de Gramont. Did she not accompany you?" inquired the Count.
"She intended to do so, but she changed her mind."
"She received a letter from me today, did she not?" continued Count Damoreau. "Yes, I remember delivering one to her myself, which Baptiste says was brought by your valet." "Did she not apprise you of its contents?" No, I was not present when she opened the letter."
"Then you do not know how she received my proposition," remarked Lady Vivian in a grating voice. "I begin to be a little doubtful myself how it will do. Is your cousin as handsome as they say she is?" "In my eyes she is the most beautiful person in the world," answered Bertha, in a tone of admiration the sincerity of which could not be mistaken. Lady Vivian looked vexed and replied, "That's a pity. Beauty is a decided objection in such a position." "I beg the lady's pardon," returned Bertha with spirit, "but I cannot perceive that my cousin's position renders her beauty objectionable." "Beauty is very suitable to you, my dear, but for a humble companion—" "A humble companion? Madelaine is not my aunt's humble companion, nor mine. She is—" "To become mine, I believe," rejoined Lady Vivian brusquely, "and I already begin to regret that I acceded to Count Demarol's wishes." "Madelaine, your ladyship's humble companion, that she will never be. Oh, Count Damarot, how could you have suggested such an idea? I would go on my knees to implore her not to consent. I am sure your ladyship will find yourself mistaken." Bertha, as she said these words, bowed with a degree of hauteur which no one had ever seen her assume, and, taking Monsieur de Bois' arm, approached her aunt with a troubled countenance. Before the Countess de Gramont could ask the cause of her evident disquietude, she said, "I wish to go home, aunt. I am wearied to death. I cannot enjoy anything tonight. That horrid Lady Vivian has made me so angry, talking of Madelaine as her humble companion. Such impertinence! Surely you would never permit anything of the kind." "Never. I do not wonder you were indignant. But do you really wish to go?" "Oh, yes, I am stifling here. I was never at such a dull ball. Pray, take me home." Her aunt could not refuse a request so vehemently urged, and begged Monsieur de Bois to seek Maurice. Fearing that Madame de Tremazon would be mortified by their early departure, the Countess took an opportunity to leave the ballroom, accompanied by her niece and son, without attracting the observation of the hostess. Monsieur de Bois joined them in the antechamber with the intelligence that Maurice was nowhere to be found. After a second search, and half an hour's delay, the carriage started without him. As soon as they reached the chateau, Bertha bade her aunt good night, and hastened to Madelaine's chamber. Madelaine, who did not anticipate her speedy return, and had not heard her light foot upon the floor, was sitting beside a small table, her head supported by her hands, and bent over some object which she contemplated with intense interest. At the sound of Bertha's voice, she hastily closed the lid of a couple of ancient-looking caskets which stood before her, and rose from her seat. "Is it you, Bertha? How soon you have returned!" "Yes, I was glad to get away. The ball was wretchedly stupid, and after that disagreeable Lady Vivian irritated me by talking of you, I could not stay. She seemed to have the audacity to expect that you would become her humble companion. You, our noble, doubly noble Madelaine, the humble companion of anyone, but especially of a coarse person as Lady Vivian. It was unendurable." "It is very possible that Count Damarot assured her that I would accept the proposition she made through him," was Madeleine's calm reply. "But you could have never entertained it for a moment." "No. There is the answer I have just written to Count Damarot. You may read it." Bertha glanced over the letter approvingly. As she laid it upon the table, she noticed the caskets. "What are these, Madelaine? Jewel cases?" "They are my mother's diamonds. They have been in the family, I can hardly tell you for how many generations." "Do let me see them." Bertha opened one of the cases. A necklace, brooch, and earrings of brilliance sparkled within. The precious stones emitted a clear luster which would have caused a connoisseur at once to pronounce them of the first water, but their setting was quaint and old-fashioned. The necklace was composed of diamonds, fleur-de-lis, divided by emerald shamrock leaves. A single fleur-de-lis, surrounded by the emerald shamrock, formed the brooch and earrings. "Some of your ancestors must have come from the Emerald Isle, so at least we may infer from this shamrock." "Yes. My great-great-great-grandfather married the beautiful Lady Catherine Nugent, and these were her bridal jewels. You see that the shamrock of Erin is mingled with the fleur-de-lis of France." Bertha unclosed the other case. It held a bracelet and a tiara-shaped comb. The shamrock and lily were blended as in the necklace. "These diamonds are very lustrous," said Bertha, clasping the bracelet admiringly upon her delicate wrist. "But what are you doing with them, and at this time of night?" "Looking at them," answered Madelaine with some hesitation. "I have not seen them for years." "You shall wear them for your bridal parure, Madelaine." Madelaine tried to laugh. "Then I shall carry my whole fortune on my back. All that remains of my ancient house I should bear, snail fashion, upon my head and shoulders. No, little dreamer, of two facts you may rest assured. One is that I shall never wear these jewels. The other is that I shall never be a bride. Come, let me undress you. Your blue eyes are so sleepy they are growing gray as the heavens at twilight." The Chateau de Trémaison was 7 miles from his father's mansion, but Maurice, after his abrupt exit from the conservatory, walked leisurely home. The next morning, before the Count had risen, his son entered the room, in travelling attire, to make the communication that he had ordered the carriage to drive him to Rennes, in time to meet the early train that started for Paris. He trusted his father would offer no objection, and would make the traveller's apologies to the ladies of the household, for avoiding the pain of leave-taking. Count Tristan approved of the journey, and a few moments later Maurice leaped into the coach, glancing eagerly up at the window, surrounded by a framework of jasmine vines, but no face looked forth. No hand waved farewell and filled the vernal frame with a living picture. The intelligence of his sudden departure was received differently by the 3 ladies. The countess was inclined to be displeased that he had foregone the ceremony of an adieu. Any shortcoming in the payment of the full amount of deference which she considered her due was a great offence. Of late, Maurice had several times wounded her upon this tender point, and her sensitiveness was thereby increased. Bertha was loud in her lamentations over the disappearance of her cousin. Her deep chagrin revived the hopes of Count Tristan and his mother, and awakened the welcome suggestion that he, in reality, held a tenderer place in her heart than she had ever admitted to herself. Madelaine's face instinctively brightened when she heard that Maurice was gone. His departure smoothed away a difficulty from the path she was about to tread. Count Tristan watched her closely, and was perplexed by the gleam of genuine satisfaction that illumined her countenance. For the first time he was half deceived into the belief that the passion of Maurice was unrequited. He had been puzzled in what manner to interpret Madelaine's determined rejection of her cousin. He was unable to comprehend a purity of motive which his narrow mind was equally incapable of experiencing. He finally attributed her conduct partially to a dread of her aunt's and his own displeasure, partially to a desire to render herself more highly valued by Maurice, and to gain a firmer hold upon his affections. Monsieur de Bois was an early visitor on the day after the ball, but never had he seemed more ill at ease, or found more difficulty in controlling his restless nervousness or in expressing himself intelligibly. When he heard that Maurice was on his way to Paris, he dashed down an antique vase by his sudden movement of vexation and, in stooping to gather the fractured china, upset the stand upon which it stood. This manifestation of awkwardness, of course, increased his malaise, and although the countess remained as unmoved as though she wholly ignored the accident, he could not recover his equanimity. Madelaine left the drawing-room with the fragments of the vase in her hand, and did not return. After a prolonged and unsatisfactory visit, Monsieur de Bois took his leave. As he issued from the chateau, Baptiste dropped his spade and followed him, keeping at a short distance behind until he neared the gate. Then the old gardener approached, looking cautiously around to see that he was not observed, stealthily held out a note, whispering, "Mademoiselle Madelaine bade me give this to monsieur," turned on his heel, and walked away as rapidly as though he feared to be pursued. The note contained these words: "A friend in my great emergency is indispensable to me. I have no friend in whom I can confide but you. I shall be at the little chalet tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock. Madelaine, Mademoiselle de Gramont." A radiant change passed over the shadowed features of Gaston de Bois as he read these lines. That one so self-reliant as Madelaine proffered him her confidence, trusted him, appealed to him for aid, was surely enough to raise him in his own esteem, and he almost forgot the recent mortification caused by an unfortunate awkwardness and miserable diffidence, which seemed the haunting demons of his existence. Impatience chased all slumber from his eyes that night, and the dawn had scarcely broken when he hastened to the chalet to await the coming of Madelaine. The appointed time had just arrived, as the watch he constantly consulted informed him, when she entered the summer-house. Their interview occupied but half an hour, but when Monsieur de Bois left the chalet, his countenance wore an expression of earnestness, responsibility, and composure totally opposite to its usual characteristics. Madelaine, as she tripped back through the dew, smiled with moist eyes, a smile of gratitude rather than of pleasure. More than once she drew a long breath, as though some heavy pressure had been lifted from her breast, as she dashed away the tears that gathered in her eyes. She seemed eagerly looking into the distance, as though a mist had rolled from before her steps, and she now saw her way clearly. All was silent in the chateau, and she reached her chamber unperceived. That day passed as usual, and another, and another. Madelaine never once alluded to the determination which she had announced to her aunt as unalterable, and the countess was satisfied that her niece had spoken under the influence of excitement, without any fixed purpose, and gradually dismissed from her mind the fear that her dependent relative would make some rash and dignity-compromising step. Bertha had not forgotten that Madelaine had declared the Château de Gramont was no longer her home, but as the latter went through the daily routine of her wonted avocations as though they were always to continue, and as no change was apparent in her manner, save that she was more silent and meditative, and her once ready smiles grew rarer, Bertha also was lulled into the belief that her cousin had abandoned her intention. Count Tristan fell into no such error. Madelaine's preoccupied mien, her unwonted reserve, the tender sadness with which she sometimes gazed around her as though bidding farewell to dear familiar objects, assured him that she had not spoken lightly, and that her threat would be carried into execution at no distant period. Well was it for her that he had come to this satisfactory conclusion, for it spared her further persecution at his hands. On the fourth morning after the departure of Maurice, Bertha entered Madelaine's chamber, according to her custom, for the young maidens always descended to breakfast together. Her room was empty. "She has not waited for me today," thought Bertha, hurrying down, and expected to find Madelaine in the breakfast-room. The countess and her son were at the table, but Madelaine was not there. "Has Madelaine breakfasted?" inquired Bertha, cutting short her morning salutations. The answer was in the negative. "Have you not seen her?" she asked. "No, not this morning," replied the countess. "I suppose she is taking her morning walk," continued Bertha. "It seems odd that she does not come back, for she is never late." Bertha seated herself, but the coffee remained untasted before her, and her head was constantly turned towards the window which commanded a view of the park and the garden. Gustave passed, and she cried out to him, "Gustave, have you seen Mademoiselle Madelaine this morning?" "No, mademoiselle." "Why, where can she be?" exclaimed Bertha impatiently. "If you will excuse me, aunt, I will go in search of her. Since she has not broken her fast yet, we will breakfast together as usual," and darted away, Bertha, into the garden. The countess had not attached any importance to Madelaine's absence, and resumed the conversation with her son. Through Count Tristan's mind the suspicion at once flashed that Madelaine was gone, and he chuckled inwardly at the verification of his own unspoken predictions. A quarter of an hour passed, and then he beheld Bertha coming rapidly from the direction of the chalet. He felt no surprise in observing that she was alone. The windows of the breakfast-room opened to the ground, and she entered by one of them, her face crimsoned, her fair hair unbound and floating over her shoulders, for she had been running. "I cannot find Madelaine," she faltered out. "It is very strange. She is not in the chalet, nor in the garden. I have called until I am hoarse. I picked up this handkerchief in the chalet. It is marked G. de Bois. Yet it is 3 days since Monsieur de Bois was here, and Madelaine and I have spent every morning since then at the chalet. When could Monsieur de Bois have dropped this handkerchief there?" The count took the handkerchief from her hand and examined the mark without comment. He could not trust his voice at that moment. "I presume Madelaine will be here presently to take account for herself," remarked the countess, apparently not discomposed. "Take your breakfast, Bertha. There is no need of your fasting until she chooses to make her appearance." Bertha obediently sat down, sipped her coffee for a few moments, and then, declaring that she wanted nothing more, left the room and returned to Madelaine's apartment. It was in perfect order, but it was always. The bed was made, but Madelaine was in the habit of making her own bed. There was no sign of change. Bertha opened the wardrobe. The dresses Madelaine usually wore were hanging within. She wandered about the room, examining every nook and corner, hardly conscious of what she was doing, what she expected to find or to miss. All at once she remarked that a few books, which were the favorites of Madelaine, and once belonged to her father, had been removed from the table. But what of that? They had probably been placed somewhere else. Continuing her almost purposeless search, Bertha now drew out the drawers of the bureau. They usually held Madelaine's linen. They were empty. In violent agitation, the kneeling girl sprang to her feet. Her undefined fear was taking shape. She ran to the antechamber and looked for the little trunk which had come to the chateau with Madelaine. It was no longer there. Bertha darted down the stair and rushed into her aunt's presence, sobbing out in agony of grief. "She has gone! Madelaine has gone! I know she has gone, and she will never, never return to us. Her dresses are there. Everything you have given her is there. She has only taken with her what she had when she came to the chateau, and she has surely gone." Count Tristan pretended to laugh at Bertha's fears, and maintained that Madelaine would presently walk in and feel very much flattered by the sensation she had created, and by her cousin's lamentations over her supposed flight, adding, jocosely, that it was not easy for a young lady to disappear in that dramatic manner, except in the pages of a novel. The countess, who began to be alarmed, desired her son to ring the bell. Gustave appeared in answer, and, after being closely questioned, was desired to summon the other domestics. Bettina and Elise promptly obeyed the command. Their answers were precisely the same as those of Gustave. They had not seen Madelaine. They could not imagine where she was. "Baptiste, where is he?" asked the countess. Baptiste was in the garden.
"I am going out. I will speak to him myself, and also institute further inquiries to satisfy our dear little Bertha. But I warn her that her dreams of romantic adventure and the flight of a young lady from an ancient chateau and her natural protectors will probably meet with a sudden check, my Madelaine's walking in from a long ramble."
Thus speaking, the Count left Bertha to be consoled by his mother, and went forth in search of Baptiste. Count Tristan knew well that, although the domestics were all warmly attached to Madelaine, the devotion of Baptiste was unsurpassed. The Count did not for one instant doubt that she was really gone. Some assistance she must have had, and Baptiste was the aid she would have naturally selected. He chose to interrogate the old man himself, to prevent his giving rather than to extract information from him. The simple-hearted gardener was not an adept in deception. He was digging among his flower-beds when his master approached him, and it did not escape the nobleman's observation that the spade went into the ground and was drawn out again with increased rapidity as he drew near, and that the head of Baptiste, instead of being lifted to see who was coming, was bent down as though he wished to appear wholly engrossed in his occupation. "Baptiste?" "Monsieur." The tremulous voice in which that one word was uttered, and his guilty countenance, scarcely raised as he spoke, was enough to convict him. "Has Mademoiselle Madelaine passed you in walking out this morning?" "No, monsieur. I have been very busy, monsieur. These flower-beds are in terrible state. It is not easy for one pair of hands to keep them even in tolerable order. I have not noticed who passed. I don't generally look about me, "Oh, very well. We thought perhaps you might have seen Mademoiselle Madelaine today, as she must have walked out, but as you know nothing at all about her, I will inform the Countess and Mademoiselle Bertha." "I am much obliged to the monsieur," replied Baptiste gratefully. He could not conceal his thankfulness at escaping the cross-examination which he had anticipated with the dread natural to one wholly unpractised in dissimulation. "The handkerchief of Monsieur Dubois was found in the chalet," continued the Count. "I suppose he sometimes strolls over here in the morning, at an hour too early for visiting. It is very natural, as we are such near neighbours." "As monsieur says, it would be very natural." The Count had gained all the information that he desired, and without letting Baptiste suspect that he had betrayed his secret. That Madelaine had actually fled, that Monsieur Dubois had lent his aid, and that Baptiste had been taken into their confidence, was indubitable. The Count returned to the chateau and joined his mother, who was making vain attempts to soothe Bertha. The only comfort to which she would listen was the assurance that, if Madelaine had really gone, she would be traced and entreated to return to her former home. The Count now thought it politic to assume an air of the deepest concern. "I am brave to bring you such unsatisfactory news, but Baptiste knows nothing. He has not seen Madelaine. I am very much shocked, but the fear that she has really left us forces itself upon me.
I will order my horse and ride over to Rennes. She probably obtained a conveyance last night or this morning to take her there, as it is the nearest town, and then by railroad or stagecoach she must have proceeded upon her journey."
"But how could she have obtained a conveyance if none of the servants were in her confidence? She must have walked, although it is 5 miles, but that cannot be, for she could not have carried her trunk. Someone must have aided her. Oh, who can it be?" Bertha wiped her streaming eyes with the handkerchief in her hand. It was the handkerchief found in the chalet, that of Gaston de Bois. It seemed to answer her question. She hesitated for some moments before she could persuade herself to communicate her suspicion, but her strong love for Madelaine and her desire that she should be restored to them prevailed. She handed the handkerchief to Count Tristan. "Before you go to Rennes, will you not return this handkerchief to Monsieur de Bois? As it was picked up in the chalet, he must have been there lately, possibly this morning. Perhaps he knows something of Madelaine's flight. Oh, he must know, he must. Make him tell you, implore him to tell you." The Count took the handkerchief, saying, "It is an admirable suggestion of yours, my dear Bertha. I will go to Monsieur de Bois at once. Meantime, do not spoil your beautiful eyes with weeping. Never fear, we will have Madelaine back shortly, and if you will only be consoled, I promise to forgive her all the anxiety she has occasioned us." Count Tristan found Monsieur de Bois at home, burrowing among musty volumes, which were the daily companions of his solitude. When he received his handkerchief, a violent fit of stammering rendered the words he attempted to utter wholly incomprehensible, and the Count made no effort to understand them. He proceeded to inform Monsieur de Bois of Madelaine's sudden disappearance, and of the great unhappiness it caused, adding that he came to him as a neighbor, to ask his advice of the best method of tracking the fugitive. If Monsieur de Bois offered any counsel, which his guest pretended to imagine he did, the impediment in his speech increased to such an extent that his suggestions were unintelligible. His perturbation might have passed for surprise at the startling intelligence so abruptly communicated, but it could hardly be translated into sorrow or sympathy, and was a very imperfect simulation of astonishment. "I am going to Rennes for the purpose of making inquiries at the railroad depot. Will not that plan be a good one?" asked the Count. "Very good," stammered Monsieur de Bois. "Can you not think of any mode that will facilitate my search?" "I fear not. None at all. I am very dull in such matters." The Count took his leave, congratulating himself that his neighbour had not been subjected to the scrutiny of the Countess de Gramont or Bertha, and especially of Maurice, whose absence at this crisis he looked upon as doubly fortunate. Count Tristan returned to the chateau with as dejected a mien as he could assume. Bertha was watching at the window and ran to meet him. "What news? When did Monsieur de Bois lose his handkerchief? When did he last see Madelaine?" "Dear child, I am deeply pained not to bring more cheering information. Monsieur de Bois must have dropped his handkerchief some days ago, the morning after the ball. He has not been here since. He has no recollection of the circumstance. He has not seen Madelaine at all." "Was he not amazed to hear that she had gone?" "Very much confounded. The shock quite bewildered him. We consulted about the best means of tracing her at Rennes. You must rest assured that Monsieur de Bois was totally ignorant of her intention to leave us, and if you will allow me to make a suggestion, I would charge you not to let him suspect, when you meet, that you for a moment imagine he was in Madelaine's confidence. That would be highly indelicate. The very supposition would be derogatory to her dignity. I have said all that is necessary to him, and as he has nothing to do with the affair, it is a topic which cannot with propriety be touched upon again." "Assuredly not," coincided the Countess. Madelaine, with all her faults, would not so entirely forget her own self-respect as to have a clandestine understanding with a young man. I cannot believe she would disgrace herself and us by such unmaidenly conduct." "Unmaidenly? Would it be unmaidenly?" questioned Bertha innocently. "If it would be an impropriety to confide in Monsieur de Bois, then Madelaine certainly has not made him her confidant. Oh, my poor Madelaine! It is dreadful to think that she must have gone away alone, quite alone." "You may well call it dreadful, Bertha. An occurrence of this kind has never blotted the annals of our family. What will be said of her and of us? Such a step taken by a woman of her birth will set hundreds of tongues discussing our domestic concerns. Our names will be bandied about from lip to lip. Our affairs will be in all sorts of common people's mouths. Hasten, for heaven's sakes, my son, and find Madelaine before this story gets wind." Count Tristan dutifully obeyed, that is to say, he assumed an appearance of compliance, for in a few moments he was galloping towards Rennes. Evening set in before he returned. His long absence had kindled in the minds of the Countess and Bertha a hope that he had discovered some clue, and the latter had worked herself up into such pitch of an excitement that she almost anticipated the return of Madelaine in Count Tristan's company. Her disappointment when at last he returned, looking weary and dejected, was proportionate to her expectations. He had made all possible search, so he said, and no information concerning the fugitive could be gathered. She was gone. He feared that they must now wait patiently until they heard from her. She would doubtless write soon. A letter might come at any moment. Very possibly she had changed her mind in regard to Lady Vivian's offer, and had accepted it without communicating her intention because she feared her aunt's displeasure. This was the most likely explanation of her sudden departure. He had called at the Chateau de Trémouzon, and Lady Vivian had left for Scotland 2 days after the ball. Madelaine was doubtless at this moment on her way to Edinburgh. The Count, though he made this assertion with an air of perfect credence, did not for a moment believe that such was Madelaine's destination, but he thought to check persistent inquiries which might accidentally bring to light some fine thread that would lead to the discovery of her retreat. "Oh, if she goes to Lady Vivian, we will make her return at once, will we not, aunt?" asked Bertha, catching eagerly at this new hope. "But Madelaine told me distinctly that she had no intention of accepting Lady Vivian's offer." "There would be no harm in changing her mind," observed the Count. "You will find that she has done so. Therefore give yourself no more uneasiness at present." Bertha would gladly have followed the Count's advice, but even if she made the effort, it would have been impossible to drive anxiety for Madelaine out of her thoughts. Several times during the evening she started up, thinking that she heard her voice. If a step echoed in the antechamber, she turned eagerly to the door, her blue eyes greatening with expectation. Once, when the roll of wheels sounded in the distance, she uttered a cry of joy and rushed out on the porch. Every moment she grew more and more restless and feverish, and, when the usual hour for retiring came, she wandered into Madelaine's room instead of her own, and once more minutely examined the whole chamber. There might perhaps be a note somewhere which she had overlooked. After the most diligent search, none was to be found. There were pens, ink, paper upon the little table which Madelaine generally used, but not a word of writing was visible. The sight of pen and ink suggested an idea which not had before occurred to Bertha. She sat down and wrote to Maurice. She poured out all her grief upon paper, and it was soothed as if dropped into words upon the blank sheet before her. How often a full heart has had its burden lifted and lightened at the pen's point, as if sorrow it recorded grew less heavy beneath the calming touch of that potent instrument. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Fairy Fingers, a novel by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 9. The Empty Place. It chanced that Bertha's letter to Maurice was posted the next morning without the knowledge of Count Tristan and his mother, not, however, through any preconcerted arrangement on the part of Bertha. Her character was so frank, so transparent, her actions always so unveiled, her thoughts flowed in such an instinctive current towards her lips, that the idea of concealment could have no spontaneous existence in her mind. She made no allusion to the letter until it was gone, but that was purely accidental, though not the less fortunate. Had Count Tristan been aware that such a letter had been written, it would never have reached its destination. It was somewhat singular that the Count, whose code of honor would have forced him to resent at the sword's point the faintest hint that he could be guilty of an unworthy action, would not have scrupled to intercept a letter, to distort a fact, we use the mildest phrase, to stoop to any deception, to be guilty of any treachery, if he were powerfully prompted by what he termed family considerations, which simply meant his own personal interest. He had determined to keep Maurice in ignorance of Madelaine's flight as long as possible, that the chances of discovering her retreat might be diminished, and was greatly in the wily schemer's consternation when he learned that Bertha had unadvisedly frustrated his plans by writing to her cousin. Madelaine's value had never been estimated to its just height until her place was empty. It is not in human nature to prize that which we possess, to hold its full worth until it is lacked and lost. Alas, in how many households there moves with noiseless feet some placid, patient, yet potent spirit, with hands ever ready to toil, to soothe, a smile ever kindled to comfort or encourage, a voice that turns common words to grace, imparting hope and dispensing joy, a presence full of helpfulness and peace, a being grown familiar to our eyes by every day's association, whom we carelessly greet or jostle against unheeding or thrust aside impatiently, never dreaming that our working-day mortal, could she cast off this garment of clay, would stand revealed one of God's holy messengers commissioned to minister. That is, until we suddenly find her place empty, yet trace the touch of her delicate fingers, the print of her light footsteps everywhere around us, and feel the dreary void made in our hearts by her absence, and recognize too late that we have entertained an angel unawares. Throughout the Chateau de Gramont there was no one, save Count Tristan, who did not make some reflection, though vague and undefined perhaps, while thinking of Madelaine. The ancient domestic seemed completely lost without her guiding hand, her spirit of order systematizing and lightening all their duties. Everything was in confusion, everything went wrong. Dearly as they loved her, they had never before realized that Mademoiselle Madelaine had been of so much importance and assistance to them all. The Countess missed her every moment, and, interested as were her regrets, they were not unmingled with some faint self-reproach when she remembered how lightly she had prized her services. The antiquated femme de chambre had never appeared so clumsy, purblind, and stupid, and the more her stately mistress chided her, the more bewildered Bettina became, the more blunders she committed. Even a bearing as majestic as that of the noble lady could not neutralizing the caricaturing effect of a robe pinned awry, curls with long straight ends standing out porcupine fashion, a cap obstinately bent upon inclining to one side, and a collar with a strong tendency to avoid a central position. As for Bertha, naturally restless, excitable, and untutored in the art of calming the agitation of her mind by active employment, she could do nothing but wander in and out of her aunt's apartment, stand at the window watching for the postman, beating the devil's tattoo upon the panes, counting the hours, fretting over their insupportable length, and breaking out at intervals in piteous lamentations. It was with difficulty that she could be persuaded to appear at table, and she scarcely tasted food. Glancing up at the faded flowers in the hanging baskets suspended before the windows, and to the withered bouquets in the tall vases that stood on either side, baskets and vases which Madelaine had ever kept freshly supplied, Bertha could scarcely restrain her tears as she murmured mournfully, "Ah, I know now what the English poet's Ophelia meant when she said all the violets withered when her father died. All our flowers faded when Madelaine went." Baptiste, who was standing beside her chair, rubbed his eyes, and the sigh that would not be checked was audible to her quick ears. She turned to give him a glance which recognized his sympathy, and noticed that there was no gay-looking blossom in his buttonhole that day. This was an unmistakable expression of sorrow on the part of Baptiste, for he never assumed the compulsory office of butler without asserting his preference for his legitimate vocation of gardener by a flower in his coat. Bertha had never seen him dispense with a floral decoration before, and she comprehended its absence but too well. Her nervous disquietude increased every hour, and caused her aunt a species of petty martyrdom resembling the torture of perpetual pin-pricking, the incessant buzzing of a stinging gnat, the endless creaking of rusty door-hinges. Minor miseries, often more unendurable than some great mental or physical suffering. But although the patience of the countess was wearied out, Bertha was too great a favourite to be rebuked. Count Tristan discreetly fled the field, and thus avoided his share of the infliction. Bertha's letter reached Maurice the day after it was written, and found him in a state of such torpid despondency that any summons to action, even the most painful, was a blessing. He felt that the only chance of combating his sorrow and preventing it obtaining full mastery over all his faculties was to work off the sense of depression by hard study, to battle against it with the arms of some engrossing occupation. But how could he spur himself up to study without an object? And he was as far as ever from obtaining his father's consent to fitting himself for the bar, or from any other professional pursuit. No, there was only one pursuit left open to him, the pursuit of pleasure, and he had not sufficiently recovered from his late shock to start off in chase of that elusive phantom. Bertha's letter roused him out of this miserable, mind-paralyzing apathy. In the very next train which left for Rennes, he was on his way back to Brittany. It was the 4th day after Madelaine's departure. Those days had seemed months to Bertha, the weariest months of her brief, glad life. She was standing at a window that commanded the road, her favorite post, and the only locality where she ever remained quiet for any length of time, when the carriage in which Maurice was seated drove up the avenue. With a joyful exclamation, she rushed out of the room, darted down the stair, through the hall, into the porch, and had greeted Maurice before anyone but the old gardener knew that he had arrived. "Have you heard from her?" were her cousin's first words, gaspingly uttered. "Not a line. She will never write. She will never come back. Oh, Maurice, I have lost all hope," sighed Bertha. "Dear Bertha, we will find her. Let her go where she may, I will find her. Be sure of that. I will not rest until I do." His grandmother, attracted by Bertha's exultant ejaculation, had followed her, though with more deliberate steps, and now appeared. The cruel words the countess had spoken to Madelaine were ringing in the ears of Maurice, and he saluted his noble relative respectfully, but not with his usual warmth. "I am glad you have come back to us, Maurice. Bertha is so lonely." The lips of Maurice parted, but some internal warning checked the bitter words before they formed themselves into sound. He bowed gravely, and, entering the house, remarked to Bertha, "You wrote that all the servants had been examined?"
"Yes, all. They know nothing of Madelaine's flight."
"That is impossible. One of them, at least, must have some knowledge." Maurice rang the bell. It was Bettina who replied. Gustave, she said, was in the stable, and Baptiste in the garden. The answers of the femme de chambre to the young Vicomte were clear and unhesitating. No one could doubt for a moment that she was wholly ignorant of Madelaine's movement, and her tone and manner evinced, as forcibly as any language could have done, how deeply she mourned over her absence. Elise was next summoned, and her replies were but a repetition of Bettina's. "I will not send for Gustave and Baptiste," he observed, dismissing the two female domestics. "I will walk out and see them."
"And I will go with you," said Bertha.
The countess was too pleased to see the cousins together to object. Gustave was grooming a horse as they passed by the stable. He paused in his work to welcome the Vicomte, and added in the same breath, "Monsieur will find it very dull at the chateau now. It does not seem like the same place since Mademoiselle Madelaine left." "Have you no idea how she went, Gustave? Some of you must surely know." "I know nothing, monsieur. When they told me that Mademoiselle Madelaine was gone, it was as though a thunderbolt had struck me. I have never felt good for anything since." There was too much sincerity, too much feeling in his tone for Maurice to doubt him, or deem further questioning necessary. He walked sadly away, accompanied by Bertha. Baptiste was busy near the little chalet. He seemed to hover about it constantly as of late. He was aware of the return of the young master. He bowed to him as he was descending from the carriage. When Bertha and her cousin approached the venerable domestic, his trepidation was too obvious to escape their notice. He was pruning the luxuriant growth of some of the vines Madelaine had planted, and the hand which held his knife shook and committed unintentional havoc among the blossoming branches. "Baptiste, come in. I have something to talk to you about," said Maurice, entering the chalet with Bertha. How painfully that pleasant little retreat reminded him of Madelaine. For the moment he was overpowered and dropped into a chair, covering his eyes with his hands, perhaps because he could not bear the sight of objects which called up such agonizing recollections, perhaps because his eyes were dim with too much womanish moisture.
"Dear Maurice," said Bertha,
bending over him compassionately,
"if Madelaine only knew how wretched she had made us both, surely she would not forsake us so cruelly."
Maurice, by a gesture, prayed her to sit down. Baptiste stood in the doorway. His attitude betokened a reluctance to enter and a desire to quickly be dismissed. After a long interval, the Vicomte, slowly raising his hand, was again struck by the perturbed mien of the guileless old man, whose native simplicity, warmth, and ingenuousness would have melted any mask he attempted to assume. Maurice had almost abandoned all expectation that he would receive any information from the domestics, but now he experienced a sudden renewal of hope. "Baptiste," he said, scrutinizing the ancient gardener closely, "do you not know where Mademoiselle Madelaine is?"
"No, monsieur."
The reply was uttered in a tone of genuine sadness. "You cannot even guess?"
"No, monsieur." Do you know how she left here? No, monsieur. Baptiste, you are not speaking falsely. You are not trifling with me. If you are, you can hardly know how cruelly you are adding to my sorrow. I have spoken the exact truth, monsieur.
I am sure he has, Maurice, interrupted Bertha. I have never known Baptiste to utter even a white lie. He has a great horror of falsehood, as Madelaine herself.
Baptiste looked at her gratefully. Then you know nothing at all? Ejaculated Maurice in a tone of discouragement. You did not help Mademoiselle Madelaine in any way? She must have had some assistance, but from you she had none? You did not even know that she intended to leave us? Baptiste hesitated. His mouth twitched. His eyes were fixed upon the ground.
Why do you not answer, Baptiste? Asked Bertha. You did not know that Mademoiselle Madelaine was going, did you?
Yes, mademoiselle.
The answer was spoken almost in a whisper.
You knew it! And why? Why have you not told us this before? She almost shrieked out.
No one asked me that question, mademoiselle, and Mademoiselle Madelaine requested me not to give out any information concerning her which I could possibly, and without uttering a falsehood, avoid.
Maurice sprang up and laid his hand upon the old man's shoulder. Speak now, then. You cannot avoid telling us all you know. You were aware that she was going. You assisted her flight. How did you aid her? What did you do? What do you know?
Very little, monsieur. I did very little, and know very little. The evening before Mademoiselle Madelaine left, she came to me in the garden. She asked me if I would do her a favor. I would have done her 1,000. Did I not owe her enough? Was it not she who watched beside my bed when I had that terrible rheumatic fever 2 years ago? Did she not pour out my medicine with her own white hands? Did she not talk to me when I was racked with pain, until I thought the room was full of heavenly music, and I forgot my suffering? Did she not keep me from cursing God when the pains were so sharp that I felt I was tortured beyond my strength? Did she not tell me why all anguish of soul or body should be borne patiently? Was there anything I would not have done for Mademoiselle Madelaine? When she left the chateau, was her loss greater to any one than it was to me? And would not she have gone if she could have stayed any longer? I was sure of that. When she said she must go, I knew she must, and I never even dared to pray her to remain.
It was so seldom that Baptiste spoke so much, for he was taciturn by nature, but the emotion, forcibly suppressed for so many days, once breaking bondage, burst forth into a torrent of words. You did well, Baptiste. Good, faithful old man. Mademoiselle Madelaine needed a friend, and I thank heaven she had one like you. Do you not think we blame you? Only tell us all you know. She came to you in the evening before she left. What favor did she ask?
Mademoiselle Madelaine only asked, monsieur, that I would come to her when all the house was quiet that night and carry down her trunk and place it in the chalet. I could not help saying, "Oh, Mademoiselle Madelaine, are you going to leave us?" She answered, "I cannot stay, Baptiste. I am compelled to go. You are the only person here who is aware of my intention. When I am gone, do not give any information concerning me that you can possibly, and without uttering a falsehood, avoid. It will be better that no one should know that I had your aid." Those were her exact words, monsieur. Go on, urged Maurice, as the narrator paused. When all the house was quiet, I put off my shoes and stole softly to Mademoiselle Madelaine's room. She opened the door and, without speaking, pointed to the little trunk. Old and weak as I am, I had no trouble in carrying it. It was light enough. It could not have held much.
Did she not bid you adieu, then?
Asked Bertha. Just as I was stooping to lift the trunk, Mademoiselle Madelaine stretched out her hand and took mine. I felt her warm, soft touch the whole day after. She did not say adieu, but she looked it. She looked as though she were blessing me and thanking me. I never saw a face that said so much that went to my very soul and comforted me. When she let go my hand, I took up the trunk and carried it out. She closed the door behind me without a sound, and I brought the trunk here that night and left it. That is all I know, monsieur. But how was the trunk conveyed hence? I do not know, monsieur.
Did you see Mademoiselle Madelaine the next morning?
Inquired Bertha. No, mademoiselle. I could not help going to the chalet the first thing when I came out to work. I pushed open the door and looked in. The trunk was not there, and I knew that Mademoiselle Madelaine had gone too. But did not Mademoiselle Madelaine drop some hint, even the faintest, of her plans? Asked Maurice earnestly. I have told monsieur every word Mademoiselle Madelaine spoke to me on the subject. Someone must have aided her further. Who could it be? Who could it possibly be? Mused Maurice. Baptiste was certain he knew alone who it could be, and he was pondering within himself whether he had the right to mention the note Madelaine had ordered him to deliver to Monsieur de Bois. Her request had been that he would give no further information he could honestly avoid. If it could be avoided, it was plain then that the intelligence ought not to be communicated. "Has monsieur done with me?" he asked, as Maurice stood reflecting in silence. "Yes, if you have nothing further to tell me." "Nothing further, monsieur." Saying these words, Baptiste withdrew.
"After Madelaine was missed," said Bertha, when the old gardener was gone, "I was the first person who came to the chalet. I found a handkerchief lying just by this table. It was marked G. de Bois."
Gaston de Bois! Then it is clear he was Madelaine's confidant. He promoted her flight.
"So I thought at first," rejoined Bertha. "But it seems this is not so. Your father took him the handkerchief, and he could not tell when or where he lost it. He was amazed to hear that Madelaine had left us and disclaimed all knowledge concerning her."
Who, then, could it have been? But I will see Monsieur de Bois myself.
"First, let me tell you," began Bertha, and faltered.
Why do you hesitate? For heaven's sake, dear Bertha, tell me everything which can throw the faintest glimmer of light upon the path Madelaine has taken.
"I do not know how to say what I am thinking. Perhaps I ought not to allude to it at all, yet it seems as if it might be true. Do you not remember that Madelaine confessed that she had bestowed her affections upon someone? Since they were not given to you, as I once believed, I cannot help imagining that perhaps she might have meant—"
Gaston de Bois?
"Yes."
Maurice did not answer, and Bertha could say no more. There was painful struggle going on in her mind, though less torturing than that which convulsed the spirit of her cousin. After he had somewhat recovered himself, he said, "At all events, I will see Monsieur de Bois. If there is nothing to be learned from him, if he really knows nothing concerning Madelaine's departure, I must seek information at Rennes. There is no time to lose. I will call upon Monsieur de Bois at once." The cousins parted at the door of the chalet.
Bertha turned towards the chateau, pausing on her way to talk with Baptiste. Maurice went in the direction of his neighbour's residence. Count Tristan's visit had taken Monsieur de Bois aback, chiefly because he was confounded by a new proof of his own awkwardness, stupidity he plainly termed it, in leaving his handkerchief behind him as a witness of his presence at the chalet. But there was no such confusing testimony to destroy his composure when he received Maurice. Besides, he had ample time to collect himself, for he was walking in the park when his valet announced that the young Viscount was awaiting him in the library. He had looked forward to the return of Maurice to Brittany as soon as the latter heard of Madelaine's mysterious disappearance. Monsieur de Bois knew that it would be more difficult to prevent her being traced by her cousin than any other person, and that it was by him Madelaine herself most feared to be discovered. Gaston was therefore fully on his guard against betraying her confidence. Maurice, on his part, was keenly sensible of the difficulty of his undertaking. He could not openly inquire of Monsieur de Bois whether Madelaine had apprised him of her intentions. The very question would have a tendency to compromise his cousin by suggesting that she was capable of holding clandestine communication with a young gentleman. Then, too, if Monsieur de Bois was really the object of her attachment, he might not be aware of the preference with which she honored him, and it would be the height of indelicacy for Maurice to allow him to suspect a circumstance which her modesty would scrupulously conceal. He was sitting in the library pondering over the embarrassments of his position when his host entered. The gentlemen greeted each other with unwonted cordiality.
"Did you return from Paris today?" asked Monsieur de Bois. "Have you just come?"
"About an hour ago. I came to you at once to—" Monsieur de Bois interrupted him. It was the policy of the former to lead the conversation, that he might avoid direct questions.
"Have you heard that Mademoiselle de Gramont left the chateau?"
"Yes. My cousin Bertha wrote to me, and—" Again Monsieur de Bois seized the thread of the conversation.
"Have you no news from Mademoiselle Madelaine? No letter?"
"None," sighed Maurice, convinced that, as Monsieur de Bois plunged into the subject in this straightforward, calm manner, he could not possibly be in her confidence. The host went on.
"Has not Count Tristan been able to obtain any trace of her?"
"Thus far, none at all. What could have become of her? Where could she have gone?" exclaimed Maurice, but not in the tone of interrogation, for he now felt assured that Monsieur de Bois could not answer.
"One thing is certain. What Mademoiselle Madelaine has done must have been prompted by a noble motive. She could not cause you all this sorrow unless she imagined herself compelled to take this step which we must all lament."
"You are right. You only do her justice," rejoined Maurice.
"What course do you propose to adopt?"
inquired Monsieur de Bois, with a perfectly natural air of friendly interest. "I hardly know what to do. I should be thankful for all advice. I shall first visit the prefecture at Rennes to see if she obtained a passport. She could not surely run the risk of attempting to travel without one. If the passport be for Great Britain, I may go to Scotland. Possibly she may have changed her mind and accepted Lady Vivian's offer. Do you not think so?"
"It does not appear to me likely. She definitely declined."
"Did she tell you so? Did she speak to you on the subject?" asked Maurice hastily. For the first time during the interview, Monsieur de Bois betrayed a slight disquietude, but he quickly collected himself and answered,
"I heard Lady Vivian speak to Mademoiselle Bertha of the offer she had made her cousin, and after that Mademoiselle Madelaine told me she had declined the proposition. But if you imagine she has changed her mind, would not a letter to Lady Vivian answer every purpose?" No. If she should be there, I must see her and use arguments which would have no force upon paper. She must be there. Where else could she be? I will start for Scotland tonight. Now I must bid you adieu. If you are going back to the chateau, I will accompany you. I must make my adieu to the ladies. I leave for Paris tomorrow. Indeed? Do you make a long stay? Probably. The Marquis de Fleury promised me a secretaryship if he were sent as an ambassador to America. It is uncertain when he may get the appointment, but he has offered me a post of confidential secretary at once. And you have accepted? Gladly. Oh, Monsieur de Bois, how I envy you! You will have an object in life, while I, who feel as though a pent-up volcano were roaring inside me, am condemned to let my struggling energies smolder beneath the ashes of my father's autocratic will. You will have heard of his opposition to my studying for the bar. What is to become of me if I am deprived of every stimulating incentive to action, especially now that— He checked himself suddenly. He was not aware that Monsieur de Bois had been informed by Bertha of Madelaine's rejection, and Maurice could not dwell upon his own disappointment to one who might be a rival. Count Tristan may gradually be brought to contemplate your wishes with more favour. Hardly. But come, if you will accompany me, let us go. Bertha, who had been waiting impatiently for the return of Maurice, did not fly to meet him when she saw Monsieur de Bois walking by his side as they approached the chateau. The countess was in the drawing-room when the gentlemen entered, and her majestic presence stemmed the stream of inquiries that was ready to gush from Bertha's lips. Monsieur de Bois, who, during his interview with Maurice, had been so self-possessed that the impediment in his speech was scarcely observable, was seized anew and cast into chains by his invisible enemy. The captive struggled in vain. The avenues of speech were barricaded. All his limbs were shackled. His movements became uncertain and spasmodic, menacing tables, chairs, vases, which, had they been gifted with consciousness, must have trembled at his approach. His nervous fingers thrust themselves into his hair and threw it into ludicrous disorder. His countenance was suffused with scarlet. He stammered out something about bidding adieu, which the ladies were evidently at a loss to comprehend, until Maurice explained that Monsieur de Bois expected to start on the morrow for Paris, where he purposed to take up his residence. "We shall regret losing so valued a neighbour," observed the countess condescendingly. Bertha made no remark, though she looked as though she wished to speak and could not summon resolution. She took an opportunity, while the countess was conversing with their guests, to whisper to her cousin, "You asked Monsieur de Bois, and he could give you no information concerning Madelaine?" "None at all," replied Maurice in a low tone. Then, turning to the countess, he said aloud, "I also must bid you adieu, grandmother. I am going immediately to Rennes. If I obtain the information there, which I think probable, I shall start at once for Scotland and seek Lady Vivian." "You have not consulted your father, Maurice," the countess answered, with an emphasis which was intended to remind him that he was not a free agent. "I must beg you to make my apologies to him." Maurice, though he treated his grandmother with the deference which left her no room for complaint, could not force himself to assume his wonted air of affection. His love for her had waned from the hour he listened to the unjust accusation, the reproaches, the contumely she had heaped upon the innocent and unfortunate orphan placed at her mercy. The softening veil had fallen from her character, and disclosed its harsh, proud selfishness and policy. He now knew that she had offered her destitute relative shelter, not from any genuine, womanly feeling of tenderness and compassion, but simply because she deemed it humiliating to allow one who bore her name to be placed in a doubtful and friendless position.
All Madelaine's gentleness, cheerfulness, diligence to please had failed to melt her aunt's impenetrable heart and make it expand to yield her a sacred place. The countess had misinterpreted her highest virtues, grossly insulted her by attributing shameful motives to her most disinterested conduct, and destroyed all the merit of her own benefactions by reminding the recipient of her indebtedness. Maurice felt that, truly to venerate a person, he must be moved by esteem for the noble qualities possessed. The recent revelation of his grandmother's actual attributes estranged and revolted him, until it became difficult to treat her with even the outward semblance of reverence. When the Vicomte bade farewell, Monsieur de Bois also took his leave.
"You will write to me as soon as you reach Edinburgh?" pleaded Bertha to her cousin.
"I will certainly write," answered Maurice. "Meantime, comfort yourself with the assurance that I will not relinquish my search until Madelaine is restored to us." And Bertha did solace herself with that pledge, for hope was a dominant characteristic of her buoyant temperament. The monotonous round of blank, weary days that ensued was happily broken, before the week closed, by the promised letter from Maurice. Bertha, whose only exciting occupation consisted in watching for the arrival and distribution of letter, was in possession of the precious missive before her aunt and Count Tristan were aware of its arrival. She tore it open, and, glancing through the contents, uttered a cry of joy that rang through the chateau, and reached the ears even of the countess and her son in the library. The next moment Bertha burst into the apartment, laughing and crying, waving the letter triumphantly over her head, exclaiming, in a voice now stifled with sobs, now broken by hysterical mirth,
"She is found! She is found! Maurice has traced her! Oh, my dear, dear Madelaine, I shall see her again!"
Her blinding tears, or her overwhelming transport, prevented her noticing the totally different effect produced upon her two relatives by this rapturously uttered communication. The face of the countess expressed a haughty satisfaction that her noble family had been spared some impending disgrace. But Count Tristan's black brows contracted, his malignant eyes flashed fiercely, he ground his teeth with suppressed rage as he snatched the letter out of Bertha's hands. She flung her arms about her aunt and laid her head lovingly upon her unsympathetic bosom, as though she must caress someone in the exuberant outburst of her joy. Meanwhile, the Count perused the letter. "My son, let me hear what Maurice says." Count Tristan read, "I hasten to send you good news, my dearest Bertha. At Rennes I visited the prefecture to examine the list of passports, knowing that Madelaine must have obtained one to travel unmolested. I found that her passport had been taken out for England. This confirmed my impression that she had joined Lady Vivian in Scotland. The passport, which, as you are aware, requires 2 responsible witnesses, was signed by Messieurs Picard and Bousset. I sought those gentlemen to extract further information from them, but, singularly enough, both had left Brittany the day after Madelaine. I cannot conceive how she obtained their signatures, for surely she had no acquaintance with them. Following this clue, I started immediately for Edinburgh, and arrived here on Wednesday evening. I had no difficulty in finding the residence of Lady Vivian. She is in London, but is expected home shortly. I had an interview with her venerable housekeeper, who answered all my inquiries with great patience. From her I learned that Lady Vivian was accompanied by a young French lady whom she had recently engaged as a dame de compagnie. The housekeeper could not remember her foreign name, but when I mentioned Mademoiselle de Gramont, she said it sounded like that. She had been informed that the young lady was very accomplished and belonged to an excellent family. Also that Lady Vivian had first heard of her during her late visit in Brittany. In answer to the question whether this young lady had arrived with Lady Vivian in London, the housekeeper replied that she did not, as she had joined her ladyship only a few days ago. Thus I feel certain that Madelaine is found. I leave for London at once, and, not many days after you receive this letter, you may expect to see us both, for I will never cease my supplications until Madelaine yields and returns with me to the Château de Gramont. I know what joy this intelligence will give you, my dear little cousin, and my joy is increased by the reflection of yours. The Count broke off without reading the concluding lines of the letter, and remarked, Maurice came to a hasty conclusion. If Vivian's dame de compagnie should prove to be Madelaine, as it may be, there is no certainty that she will yield to his persuasions and return to us. Madelaine is very obstinate and self-willed. You must pardon me, Bertha, for throwing a damper on your hopes, but I would spare you too severe disappointment.
I shall not be disappointed. I feel sure Maurice has discovered Madelaine. That is all I ask for the present. You may be right about her refusing to return here, I dare say you are, but that will not make me miserable, which I should be if we could not find her at all. I mean to ask my uncle's permission to allow Madelaine to reside with us. I do not see how he can refuse, and he is very indulgent, so that, whether Madelaine consents to return here or not, we shall be wholly parted.
Bertha did not suspect into what fury her words were lashing the Count, nor did she divine the machinations already at work within his perfidious spirit to defeat her kindly purpose. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Fairy Fingers by Anna Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 10. The Humble Companion. Rapidly as Maurice travelled from Edinburgh to London, the distance seemed interminable to his impetuous spirit. Multitudes of arguments were driven through his mind in long array, and he was impatient to prove their power in persuading Madelaine to return. Was it possible that she could refuse to see their force? If calm reasoning, if entreaties and prayers failed to move her, he would test the potency of a threat. She should learn that he had vowed never to return to his paternal home, never to forgive those who had driven her forth by their cruelty until she had proclaimed their pardon by again taking up her abode at the Château de Gramont. Madelaine, who shrank from all strife, who moved in an atmosphere of harmony which seemed to envelop her whenever she went, would not lift her hand to sever the sacred bond of union between father and son, grandmother and grandchild. Whatever anguish it might cost her to yield, however great her sacrifice, she would endure the one and accept the other, rather than become the instrument that, with fatal blow, struck such an unholy severance. Maurice vividly pictured to himself his approaching interview under a tantalizing variety of circumstances. Now he imagined that he saw Madelaine only in the presence of her new friends, that she was cold and reserved, and allowed him no opportunity of uttering a word that could reach her ear alone. Now he fancied that she had granted him a private interview, that she was sitting by his side, but resolute, unconvinced, unmoved, while he besieged her with arguments, appealed to her with all the passionate fervor that convulsed his soul, portrayed in darkest colors the fearful results of her inflexibility. Now he painted her overwhelmed by his reasoning, melted by his application, terrified that by terrible menace, and finally consenting to his position. It was past 10 o'clock when the train reached the London terminus. The loquacious Edinburgh housekeeper had informed him that Lady Vivian was the guest of Lady Augusta Langdon. The lateness of the hour forbade a visit that night. Yet, after having engaged a room at Morley's Hotel, he could not help strolling in the direction of Grosvenor Square, and was soon searching for the number he had written on his tablets. It was easily found, and Maurice stood before one of the most sumptuous of the magnificent edifices which adorn that aristocratic locality. The windows were thrown open, and the richly embroidered lace curtains drawn back, for the evening was more than usually sultry. He crossed to the opposite side of the street, and took up a position which enabled him to distinguish forms moving about in the spacious drawing-room. With what straining eyes and breathless anxiety he scrutinized them! Now he saw a lady of noble carriage walking to and fro. That might be Lady Langdon. By and by he caught sight of a gaunt, ungainly figure, and recognized Lady Vivian. Who would have believed that a glimpse of that angular, unsymmetrical form could have ever called such a radiance to the eyes of a young and handsome man, could have kindled such a glow upon his cheek, could have quickened his pulses with so joyful a motion? Not long after, a group of young ladies clustered together just beneath the chandelier to examine some object which one of them held in her hand, and now the heart of Maurice throbbed so tumultuously that its beats became audible. He had singled out one maiden whose height and graceful proportions distinguished her from her companions. Madelaine. Her face was turned from him, but surely that statuesque outline, that slender, flexible throat, that exquisitely shaped head, about which he thought he traced the coronal braid that usually crowned her noble brow, these could only belong to Madelaine. Could he fail to recognize them anywhere or at any distance? The longer he gazed, the more certain he became that it was she herself, that she was found at last. How eagerly he watched to see her turn and render assurance doubly sure by revealing her lovely countenance. She remained some time in the same position. Then the little group dispersed, and she glided away, but not in the direction of the window. The eyes of Maurice never moved from the place where she had disappeared, though he was conscious of attracting the attention of passers-by, and now and then a whispered comment of derision fell upon his ear. Several equipages drove up to Lady Langdon's door, and her guests gradually departed. Soon after, the drawing-room was deserted. The lights were extinguished. The windows closed. Other lights brightened the casements above. Still Maurice remained riveted to the spot, unreasonably hoping to behold Madelaine for one fleeting moment again. By and by, one window after another grew dark, but not until the last light went out could he force himself to turn away and retrace his steps to the hotel. Will the dawn never come? How often that question rises involuntarily to the lips, through the long light of expectation that precedes a wished-for day. Time, that is, the sense of its duration, is but another word for state of mind. The length or briefness of the hour is so completely governed by the mood of one's spirits that it becomes easy for those who have learned this truth from experience to conceive 1,000 years but as a day to the blessed, a day of torture, an age to the miserable, and to comprehend that time itself and its computation must be replaced by state in the eternal hereafter, where we shall live in the spirit only. Will the dawn never come? Maurice repeated hundreds of times, as that night dragged its leaden, lagging feet with the slow movement of centuries. The dim, late London morning came at last to bring with it a new perplexity. It would be a breach of etiquette to call upon Lady Vivian at too early an hour, Yet how was Maurice to curb the headlong rush of his impatience until the prescribed period for ceremonious visits arrived? A stranger in London, it might be supposed that the numberless noteworthy objects by which he was environed might have diverted his attention, but one engrossing thought so completely filled his whole being that it rendered him blind to all the marvels of art or beauties of nature. Yet to remain imprisoned at the hotel was out of the question. He concluded to spend his morning in Hyde Park, chiefly because it was not far distant from Grosvenor Square. But the attractions of the noble park, through which he listlessly sauntered, and of the adjacent Kensington Gardens, to which he unconsciously extended his rambles, were entirely lost upon the distracted wanderer. Grand old trees, romantic walks, delicious flowers, had no existence for him. The whole world was one great, hueless, formless void, in which he beheld nothing but the spectral image mirrored in his own soul. He had decided not to pay his visit until after 1 o'clock, but before the sun reached its meridian, he absolved himself from the propriety of waiting, and with rapid steps once more took his way to Lady Langdon's residence. The door was opened by a solemn footman. "Is Lady Vivian at home?" "Not at home, sir." "Is Mademoiselle de Gramont, I mean the young lady who accompanied Lady Vivian, at home?" "Not at home, sir." "Can you tell me when I shall be likely to find them?" "Her ladyship gave no orders on the subject, sir." Maurice stood, perplexed and hesitating. "Your card, if you please, sir," suggested the demure domestic. "No, I will call again by and by." Maurice walked directly back to the park. His suspense was intolerable. He could endure it only for another hour, and then return to Lady Langdon's. The staid attendant reappeared at his knock. "Has Lady Vivian returned?" "Not returned, sir." "Can you tell me when I may depend upon seeing her? I call upon a matter of great importance." The stately footman looked as though he were pondering upon the propriety of making any satisfactory answer to this question. Maurice repeated the inquiry with such an anxious intonation, such a perturbed air, that the stoic domestic, accustomed to behold only the conventional composure which allows no pulse to betray its beating, was moved out of the even tenor of his way by astonishment. "Lady Vivian went with my lady and a large party to Hampton Court. Their ladyships will probably spend the day." "The day!" exclaimed Maurice in an accent of consternation. The footman evidently thought that he had proffered more than sufficient information, and made a dignified attempt to put a close to the interview by extending his hand and saying, "I will see that your card reaches her ladyship." "No, there is no need of my leaving my card. I shall return. At what hour does Lady Langdon dine?" "At 7, sir." "I will take the liberty of calling after dinner." The footman looked as though he decidedly thought it was a liberty, and Maurice turned slowly away from the closing door. What could be done to shorten the endless hours that stretched their weary length between that period and evening? Hampton Court. What was to prevent him from going to Hampton Court? He might meet Lady Vivian and Madelaine there. Nothing was more lively, since they were to spend the day. His spirits revived as he signalled an empty cab and requested to be driven as rapidly as possible to Hampton Court. He took no note of the length of time occupied in reaching his destination. It was a relief to be in motion, and to know that every moment brought him nearer a locality where the lost one might be found. Was he more likely to encounter her in the palace or in the grounds? He asked internally as he sprang out of the cab. He would try the palace first. He strode through its magnificent apartments one after another, without noticing their gorgeous grandeur, without glancing at their superb decorations, without wasting a look upon the wondrous products of the brush or chisel or loom. His disconcerted guide paused before each world-renowned masterpiece in vain. Maurice hurried on, and silenced him by saying that he was in search of a friend. Neither Lady Vivian nor Madelaine was to be seen. They were doubtless rambling in the beautiful pleasure grounds. Maurice took his way through the noble avenues of trees, through groves, gardens, conservatories, without letting his eyes dwell upon any object but the human beings he passed. Still no Madelaine. He made the tour of the palace the second time, and then traversed the grounds once more. The results were the same. Lady Vivian must have returned home. It was growing late. He re-entered his cab and ordered the driver to take him to Morley's Hotel, paid the exorbitant price which the man, knowing that he had to deal with a stranger, demanded, and took refuge in his chamber, without remembering that he had not broken his fast since morning, until a waiter knocked at the door to know if he would dine. Yes, dinner might assist in whiling away the time, but it helped less effectually than he had anticipated, for to dine without appetite is a tedious undertaking. His own busy thoughts supplied him with more than sufficient food, and precluded all sense of hunger. Maurice had but a slight acquaintance with Lady Vivian. An evening visit certainly was not selon les règles, but all ceremony must give way before the urgency of his mission. He compelled himself to wait until 9 o'clock before he again appeared in Grosvenor Square. That imperturbable footman again. The very presence of the automaton chilled and dispirited the impatient visitor. "Is Lady Vivian at home?" "Her ladyship is indisposed and has retired, sir." "Can I see Mademoiselle de Gramont?" "Whom, sir?" "The young lady who accompanies Lady Vivian." "She is with Lady Vivian, but I will take your card, sir." Maurice had no alternative, and handed his card. "Say that I earnestly beg to see her for a few moments." Did he imagine that the human machine could deliver a message that conveyed the suggestion that anyone very earnestly desired anything in creation? The Vicomte was ushered into the drawing-room. A long interval, or one Maurice thought long, elapsed before the messenger returned. "The ladies will be happy to see you, sir, tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Another night and another morning to struggle through, haunted by the murderous desire of killing that which could never be restored. Time. But here, at least, was a definite appointment, a fixed period when he should certainly see Madelaine. This was a great step gained. He had heard some gentlemen at the hotel loud in praise of Charles Keen's impersonation of King John, which was to be represented that evening, and the recollection of their economies decided him to visit the Princess's Theatre. Our powers of appreciation are limited, governed, crippled, or expanded by the mood of the moment, and a performance which might have roused him to a high pitch of enthusiasm at another time now seemed dull and tedious. But duller and more tedious still was the night that followed. And when morning came, how was he to consume the hours betwixt breakfast and 2 o'clock? He must go somewhere, must keep on his feet, must give his restless limbs free action. He bethought him of St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey. These majestic edifices were associated with the memory of those who had done with time, and might assist him in the time-annihilating process, which was then his chief object. He was mistaken. He could not interest himself in monuments to the dead. He was too closely pursued by a living phantom. He walked through the aisles, the chapels, the crypt, with as much indifference as he had wandered through Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, and Hampton Court. The appointed hour drew near, at last, and with rising excitement he ordered the coachman to drive to Grosvenor Square, number . It was just two, hardly two, perhaps. The inevitable footman received his card with the faintest soupçon of a grin, and conducted him to the drawing-room. Lady Vivian entered a few moments afterwards. She was delighted to see him, very flattered at a visit. When did he come to London? Would he make a long stay? How did he leave their friends in Brittany? Maurice replied as composedly as possible to her inquiries, and then asked, "May I be allowed to see Mademoiselle de Gramont?" "Mademoiselle de Gramont?" exclaimed Lady Vivian, raising her bushy eyebrows. "Yes, she is with you. She is engaged as your humble companion, is she not?" "No, I have not the pleasure of her acquaintance." If a bullet had passed through Maurice, he could not have sprung back in his seat with a wilder bound, and hardly have dropped back more motionless. Lady Vivian looked at him in amazement, asked what had happened. Was he ill? Would he take anything? He had been very much fatigued, perhaps. He was so very pale, she felt quite alarmed. Really, it was distressing. Making a desperate effort to recover from the stunning blow, he faltered out, "I heard that you had made Mademoiselle de Gramont a proposition to become my humble companion. Yes, I did so at the request of Count Demarest, but she definitely declined, and I felt much relieved, for she was entirely too handsome for the position. Shortly afterwards, I heard of a young person who suited me much better. I thought it was a mistake of the footman's last night when you said you desired to see the young lady who accompanied me. It was somewhat singular to have one's humble companion included in a visit to oneself. Now I comprehend that you thought she was your cousin. I hope you are feeling better. Your color is coming again." Maurice was not listening. He had lost Madelaine anew. The agony of a second bereavement, the mystery that enveloped her fate, the dreadful uncertainty of tracing her, pressed upon him and rent his soul with fiercer throes than before. Muttering some hurried apology, he rose, staggered towards the door, and, to the amazement of the stoical footman, who was greatly scandalized thereby, the pertinacious stranger fairly reeled past him into the street. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt, Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 11. Pursuit. Maurice, when he took his abrupt leave of Lady Vivian, did not return to the hotel. He felt as though he could not breathe, could not exist, shut within four walls, with the oppressive weight of his new disappointment crushing and stifling his spirit. He traversed the streets with a rapid pace, not knowing nor caring whither he went, if only he kept in motion. His own torturing thoughts pursued him like haunting fiends, driving him mercilessly hither and thither, and he sped onward and onward as though by increased celerity he could fly from his own intangible persecutors. Now sprang up the tantalizing suggestion that, as Lady Vivian had never seen Madelaine, the latter had presented herself under a feigned name, for the sake of concealing her rank, and baffling the friends who sought to discover her abode. Was not that very possible, very natural? He recalled the tall, finely moulded form of which he had caught a glimpse in Lady Langdon's salon, and for a while he cherished this chimera. Then its place was usurped by one more painful. Madelaine was perhaps traveling alone, subjected by her very beauty to the curious scrutiny, the heartless insults of brutal men, and, perchance, through her ignorance of the world, trapped into some snare from which she could never be extricated unharmed. Then his mind was filled with the horrible idea that, in her friendlessness and despair, finding no place of refuge on earth, she had flung away her burdensome life into violent hands. Nothing was more improbable than that a being endowed with her self-controlled, serene, sorrow-accepting temperament should be driven to such an act of unholy madness. Yet Maurice allowed the frightful fantasy to work within his brain until it clothed itself with a shape like reality, and drove him to the verge of distraction. Where could she have gone? Where, oh where? Hundreds of times he asked himself that perplexing question. All the pursuing demons seemed to shout it in his ears, and to defy him answer. If she had escaped the perils he most dreaded, where had she hidden herself? Perhaps she had only taken out a passport for England, with a view of throwing those who sought to track her steps off the right scent. If she had gone to England, her passport must have been visaed as she passed through Paris. If it had not been presented at the Bureau de Passeport, she must have remained in Paris. If she had conceived any plans by which she thought to earn a livelihood, where could they so well be carried into execution? In that great city she might reasonably hope to be lost in the crowd, and draw breath untraced and unknown. If she had left the metropolis, the fact could easily be ascertained by examining the list of passports. Maurice walked on, until gradually the clamorous city grew silent, and the streets were deserted. Besides the vigilant police, only a few late revellers, with uncertain steps and faces hardly more haggard than his own, passed him, from time to time. Still he walked, carrying his hat in his hand, that the night breeze might cool his fevered brow. There was a stir of wheels again, a waking up movement around him, shop windows lifting their shuttered lids and opening their closed eyes, men and women bustling forward with busy, refreshed morning faces. Another day had dawned and brought its weight of anguish for endurance. Maurice had paced the streets all night. The light that struck sharply upon his bloodshot eyes first made him aware of the new morning. The season for action then had arrived. The night had flown as a hideous dream. He did not know into what part of London he had wandered, but he hailed a cab, sprang in, and gave the order to be driven to Morley's. The distance seemed insupportably long. He was now tormented by the fear that he should not reach his destination in time to take the first train for Dover. When he alighted at the hotel, he learned that in less than an hour the train would start. He dashed off a few incoherent, sorrowful lines to Bertha, hastily crammed his clothes into his trunk, paid his bill, drove to the station, and secured a seat 1 moment before the railway carriages were in motion. After he crossed the Channel and entered a railway coach at Calais, utter exhaustion succeeded to his state of turbulent wretchedness. Nature asserted her soothing rights and poured over his bruised spirit the balm of sleep. With reviving strength came renewed hope, and when he awoke at the terminus in Paris, he was inspired with the conviction that he should find Madelaine in that vast metropolis, a conviction as firm as the belief he had entertained that he would behold her in Scotland, and afterwards that he would discover her in London. He hastened to the Bureau de Passeport and examined the list. No passport had been visa to which her name was attached. It was then certain that she was still in Paris. But what method could he devise for a systematic search? He thought of the Argus-eyed, keen-scented police, who, with the faintest clue, could trace out any footprint once made within the precincts of the far-spreading barriers. But could he drag his cousin's name before those public authorities? Could he describe her person to them, and enter into details which would enable them to hunt her down like a criminal? Delicacy, manly feeling forbade. He must seek her himself, unaided, unguided, and a superstitious faith grew strong within him that, through his unremitting search, never foregone, never relaxed, he would discover her at last. His plan was sufficiently vague and wild. He resolved to scour Paris from end to end, scanning every face that passed him, until the light shone upon hers, and kindled up once more his darkened existence. When he last returned from Brittany, he had engaged one small, plain apartment in Rue Bonaparte, the Latin quarter of the city, a favorite locality of students. Here he again took up his abode, or rather here he passed his nights. He could scarcely be said to have a dwelling place by day. From dawn until late in the evening he wandered through the streets, peering into every youthful countenance that flitted by him, quickening his pace if he caught sight of some graceful female form above the ordinary stature, and plunging onward in pursuit, with his heart throbbing madly, and his fevered brain cheating him with phantoms. His search became almost a monomania. His mind, fixed strainingly upon this one all-engrossing object, lost its balance, and he could no longer reason upon his own course, or see its futility, or devise a better. The invariable disappointment which closed every day's search, by some strange contradiction, only confirmed him in the belief that Madelaine was in Paris, and that he could shortly find her there, that he would meet her by some fortunate chance, would be drawn to her by some mysterious magnetic instinct. Every few days he visited the Bureau de Passeport to ascertain whether her passport had been presented to be viséd. To the friends he daily encountered he scarcely spoke, but hurried past them with hasty greeting, and a painfully engrossed look, which caused the sympathetic to turn their heads and gaze after him, wondering at the disordered attire and unsettled demeanor of the once elegant and vivacious young nobleman, who had graced the most courtly circles, and was looked upon as the very glass of fashion, a mould of form. Maurice had been nearly a month in Paris, passing his days in the manner we have described, when, for the first time, he encountered Gaston de Bois. The former would have hastened on, and only the rapid salutation which had grown habitual to him, but M. de Bois stopped him with an outstretched hand and said, "Where have you hidden yourself? I have been expecting to see you ever since I came to Paris, but I could not discover where you were lodged." "My lodgings are in the Rue Bonaparte, numero blank," returned Maurice abruptly, "but I am seldom at home." "You will force me to take my chance of finding you?" asked M. de Bois, forcibly struck by his friend's altered appearance. "Or," he added, "you will come to see me instead. I am at the Hotel Maurice at present." "Thank you," said Maurice absently, glancing around him at the passers-by as he spoke. "Good morning." M. de Bois would not be shaken off thus unceremoniously. He was too much distressed by the evident mental condition of the Vicomte. He turned and walked beside him, though conscious that Maurice looked annoyed. "When we parted, did you go to Scotland as you proposed?" inquired Gaston. "Yes, but Lady Vivian was in London. I sought her there. She knew nothing of my cousin. I returned to Paris, for I am sure Madelaine is here." "Here?" almost gasped M. de Bois, stopping suddenly. Maurice walked on without even noticing the strange confusion that arrested his companion's steps. The latter recovered himself and rejoined him, asking, in as unconcerned tone as he could command, "What caused you to think so?" "I am certain of it. Her passport was taken out for England, but it has not been viséd in Paris. She must be here still, and I know that I shall find her. I have walked the streets day after day, hoping to meet her, and I tell you I must." M. de Bois, whose equanimity had only been disturbed for a moment, shook his head sorrowfully, saying, "I fear not. It does not seem likely." "To me it does. 50 times I have thought I caught sight of her, but she disappeared before I could make my way through the crowd to the spot where she was standing. This will not last forever. Ere long we shall meet face to face." "I hope so. I heartily hope so. I would give all I possess, though that is little enough, to have it so." These words were spoke with such generous warmth that Maurice was moved. He had not before noticed the change in his Breton neighbour, a change the precise opposite to the one which had taken place in himself, yet quite as remarkable. Gaston's address was no longer nervous and flurried. He had gained considerable self-command and repose of manner. The air of uncomfortable diffidence, which formerly characterized his deportment, had disappeared, and had given place to a manly and cheerful bearing. "If he loves Madelaine," thought Maurice, "how can he look so calm while she is God only knows where, and exposed to what dangers?" "Have you heard from Mademoiselle Bertha?" asked Monsieur de Bois, with some hesitation. "Yes, several times. My cousin Bertha was broken-hearted at the news I sent her from London, but I trust that soon—" He did not conclude the sentence. His wan face lighted up. His restless, straining eyes were fastened upon some form that passed in a carriage. Without even bidding Monsieur de Bois good morning, he broke away and pursued the carriage. For some time he kept up with it, but Gaston saw him motion vehemently to the sleepy coachman, who was lazily driving an empty fiacre. The next moment Maurice had opened the door himself and leaped into the vehicle. It followed the carriage the Vicomte had kept in view, and soon both were out of sight. The imagination of Maurice had become so highly inflamed that forms and faces constantly took the outlines and lineaments of those ever present to his mind. And when, after some exhausting pursuits, he approached near enough for the elusive likeness to fade away, or when the shape he was impetuously making towards was lost to sight before it could be neared, he always felt as though he had been upon the eve of that discovery upon which all his energies were concentrated. After their accidental encounter, Gaston Dubois called upon Maurice repeatedly, but never found him at home. Bertha continued to write sorrowful letters teeming with inquiries. Maurice answered briefly, as though he could not spare time to devote to his pen, but always giving her hope that the very next letter would convey the glad intelligence which she pined to receive. 4 months was the limit of her yearly visit to the Château de Gramont, and the period of her stay was rapidly drawing to a close. She wrote that in a few days her uncle would arrive to take her back to his residence in Bordeaux. The language in which this communication was made plainly indicated that she would rejoice at the change. She touched upon the probability of seeing Maurice before she left, but he was unmoved by the half-invitation. Nothing could induce him to leave Paris while he cherished the belief that Madelaine was within its walls. Count Tristan wrote and urged him to return home, but the summons was unheeded. He could not have endured, while his mind was in this terrible state of incertitude, to behold again the old chateau, which must conjure up so many harrowing recollections. Then, too, his natural affection for his father and his grandmother was embittered by the remembrance of their persecution of Madelaine. Until she had been found, until he could hear from her own lips, as he knew he should, that she harbored no animosity towards them, he could not force himself to forgive their injustice and cruelty. She alone had power to soften his heart and cement anew the broken link. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Fairy Fingers by Anna Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 12. The Sisters of Charity. The marvelous change in the bearing of Gaston de Bois, by which Maurice was struck, had been wrought by a triad of agents. A man who had passed his life in indolent seclusion, who had plunged into a tangled labyrinth of obtuse books, not in search of valuable knowledge, but to lose in mazes of recollection of valueless hours, who had allowed his days to drag in aimless monotony, who had fallen into melancholy because he lacked a healthy stimulus to arouse his faculties out of their life-deadening torpidity, who had allowed his nervous diffidence to gain such complete mastery over him that it tied his tongue, and clouded his vision, and confused his brain, who despised himself because he was keenly conscious that his existence was purposeless and profitless. This man, subjected to the sudden impetus of an occupation for which his mental acquirements and sedentary habits alike fitted him, found his new life a revelation. He had emerged from the dusty, beaten, grass-withered path his feet had spiritlessly trodden from his earliest youth, and entered a field of bloom and verdure where the very stir of the atmosphere exhilarated, where the labor to be performed called dormant capacities into play and tested their strength, where each day's achievement gave the delightful assurance of latent powers within himself hitherto unrecognized. In a word, where his manhood was developed through the regenerating virtue, the glorious might, the blessed privilege of work. The second cause which contributed to bring about the happy metamorphosis in Gaston du Bois sprang out of the hope-inspired words Madelaine had dropped on that day which closed so darkly on the Duke's orphan daughter. Those few, passing, precious words had fallen like fructus seed and struck deep root in Gaston's spirit. And, as the germs shot upward, every branch was covered with blossoms of hope, which perfumed his nights and days. He dared to believe that Bertha did not look upon him with disdain, that she sympathized with the misfortune which debarred him from free intercourse with society, that a deeper interest might emanate from this compassionate regard. The possibility of becoming worthy of her no longer appeared a dream so wild and baseless, but he was too modest, too distrustful of himself, to have given that golden dream entertainment had it not been inspired by Madelaine's kindly breath. The third cause which combined with the two just mentioned to revolutionize his character will unfold itself hereafter. The more cognizant M. du Bois became that powerful influences were vivifying, strengthening, and bringing order out of confusion in his own mind, the more troubled he felt in pondering over the disordered mental condition of Maurice. During the whole month after their accidental encounter in the street, he called repeatedly at the lodgings of the Vicomte, but never once found him at home. Half discouraged, yet unwilling to abandon the hope of an interview, he persisted in his fruitless visits. One morning, to his unbounded satisfaction, when he inquired of the concierge if Monsieur de Gramont was within, an affirmative answer was returned. Gaston could hardly credit the welcome intelligence, and involuntarily repeated the question. "Ah, yes, poor gentleman, he's not likely to be out again soon," replied his informant with a pitying tone. Without waiting for an explanation of these mysterious words, M. du Bois quickly ascended to the 5th story, and, being admitted to the antechamber by a neat-looking domestic, knocked at the door of the apartment which was indicated to him. The voice of a stranger bade him enter. He turned the doorknob with a shaking hand. The room was so small that it could be taken in at a single glance. It was a plain, almost furnitureless apartment. In the narrow bed lay Maurice. His eyes, those great blue eyes which so strongly resembled Bertha's, were glittering with the wild lights of delirium. Fever burned in his cheeks and seemed to scorch his parched lips. The fair, clustering curls were matted and tangled about his brow. His arms were tossing restlessly about. He sprang up into a sitting posture as Gaston appeared at the door, and gazed at him eagerly, then stared around, peering into every corner of the chamber, as though in quest of someone. Those searching glances were followed by a look of blank despair that settled heavily upon his pain-contracted features as he sank back and closed his eyes. Beside the bed sat a woman, clad in the shapeless dress of black serge, when wearing the widely projecting white bonnet and cape, black veil, and white band across the brow beneath the chin, which composed the attire of a sister de bon secours. She was one of that community of self-abnegating women who, bound by holy vows, devote their lives to the care of the suffering, and are the most skilful, tender, and zealous nurses that France affords. Just beyond the good sister stood a young man, poring over a piece of paper, which had the appearance of a medical prescription. A spirited-looking youth, whose harmonious and intellectual cast of feature was heightened to rare beauty by richly mellowing coloring, and the silken curves of a beard and moustache unprofaned by a razor, curves softly traced above the fresh, rubious lips, and gracefully deepening about the cheeks and chin, curves that disappear forever when the civilizing barbarism of shaving has been accepted. He came forward when Monsieur de Bois entered, and accosted him in an earnest, rapid tone. "I hope, sir, that you are a friend of this gentleman. Am I right in my supposition?" Yes. What has happened?" asked Monsieur de Bois, his countenance plainly betokening his alarm. "I occupy the adjoining apartment," continued the stranger. "My name is Walton. 3 nights ago I was startled by the sound of some object falling heavily near my door, followed by a deep groan. I found this gentleman lying on the ground, apparently insensible. I carried him into his chamber, laid him upon his bed, and summoned the concierge. The name inscribed on his book is the Vicomte Maurice de Gramont, and his last residence the chateau of his father, Count Tristan de Gramont, in Brittany near Rennes. I took myself the responsibility of calling a physician, Dr. Dupont, and through his advice of engaging this good sister, one of the Sieur Bon Secours, as a nurse. Dr. Dupont wrote to his patient's father, but no answer has been received. I have been with your friend very constantly. You perceive he has a raging fever. He talks a great deal, but too incoherently to be able to answer any questions or to give any directions." This information was communicated with quick, energetic intonation, while the speaker stood fanning Maurice and preventing the hand which he flung about from striking against the wall. There was a confident rapidity in the stranger's movement, a vigorous manliness and self-dependence in his bearing, strikingly dissimilar to the deportment which usually characterizes young Parisians at the same age. Though he spoke the French language with fluent correctness, a slightly foreign accent betrayed to Monsieur de Bois that he was not a native of France. Gaston thanked him warmly, as his troublesome impediment permitted, and said that he would write himself to the Count de Gramont. Then, bending over his friend, took his hot, unquiet hand, and spoke to him again and again. His voice failed to touch any chord of memory and cause it to vibrate in recognition. Maurice was muttering the same word over and over. Gaston hardly needed to bow his head to catch the imperfect sound. He knew before he heard distinctly that it was the name of Madelaine. "Had you not better write your letter immediately?" asked young Walton. "Will you walk into my room? I do not see any writing materials here. Mine are at your service." Gaston, as he followed the stranger into the adjoining chamber, could not but be struck by the easy, offhand, decided manner in which he spoke, and the promptitude with which he desired to accomplish the work to be done. Mr. Walton's sitting-room, which was separated from the bedchamber, was much larger than the apartment of Maurice. It had an air of great comfort, if not decided elegance, and testified to the literary and artistic taste of its occupants. The walls were decorated with fine photographic views and some early efforts in painting. Here stood an easel holding an unfinished picture, there an open piano, further on a convenient writing table, and in the center another table covered with books and portfolios. Materials for writing and sketching were scattered about with a bachelor's disregard for order. I will clear you a space here, said he, sweeping the contents of one table upon another, already overburdened. Everything is in a confusion, for I have been working at odd moments. I could not make up my mind to go into the studio. I would not leave that poor fellow until somebody claimed him. What an interesting face he has! If only he was better, I would make a sketch. His countenance is just my beau ideal of the young Saxon knight in a historical picture I am painting. A man always finds materials for art just beneath his hands, if he only has wit and thrift to stoop together them as he goes. But I fear I am interrupting you. Make yourself at home. I will leave you while you are writing. Really, I cannot express how glad I am that you have come at last. I have been looking for you, that is, for somebody who knew Monsieur de Gramont every moment for 2 days. After drawing back the curtains to give Monsieur de Bois more light, and glancing around to see that he was supplied with all that he could require, the young artist returned to the apartment of Maurice. Ronald Walton was born of South Carolinian parents, their only child. His boyhood was not passed in a locality calculated to develop artistic instincts, nor had his education afforded him artistic advantages, nor had he been thrown in a sphere of artistic associates. Yet from the time his tiny fingers could hold brush or pencil, he had seized upon the engravings of romantic scenery, copied them on an enlarged scale, and painted them in oil to the astonishment of his parents and friends. When his young companions extracted enjoyment from fish-hook and gun, and hilariously filled game bags and fishing baskets, he sat quietly, drinking in a higher, more humane delight before his easel. These tastes, as they strengthened, caused his father, though a liberal and cultivated man, severe disappointment. At times he even disposed to place a compulsory check upon his son's artistic proclivities, but the soft, persuasive voice of the gentle, refined, clear-sighted mother interposed. She had made the most study of her child's character, and had faith in his fitness for the vocation he desired to adopt. She pleaded that his obvious gift might be tested and proved spurious or genuine before it was trampled under foot as unworthy of recognition, and her heart wisdom finally prevailed. Ronald was sent to Paris to study under a distinguished master. During 3 years he had made golden use of his opportunities. He was remarkable among his fellow students for his indomitable perseverance and his powers of concentrating all his thoughts upon his work. He experienced a desire to attain excellence for its own sake, not for the petty ambition of excelling others. Thus he became very popular among his associates and excited their admiration, without ever awakening the jealousies of wounded self-love. Though he had determined to devote his life to art, from the conviction that it was the vocation for which he came commissioned from the Creator's hands, there was nothing morbid in his passion for his profession. It was a healthy love of the beautiful in outward form, springing from the love of all which the beautiful typifies, combining with a strong impulse to represent and perpetuate the haunting image of varied loveliness which constantly floated through his brain. The young Carolinian was called an enthusiast even by his French fellow-students, with whom enthusiasm is an inheritance, but his enthusiasm was allied to a severely critical taste, a rare combination, being grafted upon a tree of practicability, indigenous to the soil of his young country. It brought down his ideal conceptions into actual execution. The philosopher of the present day scouts at enthusiasm, but what agent is half so mighty in giving the needful spur to genius? Enthusiasm kindles a new flame in the chilled soul when the ashes of disappointment have extinguished its fires. Enthusiasm reinvigorates, embraces the spirit that has become weary and inebriated in the oppressive atmosphere of uncongenial entourage. Enthusiasm is the cool, refreshing breeze of a warm climate and the blazing log of cold. Ronald's unexhausted enthusiasm was the secret fountain whose waters nourished laurels for him in the gardens of success. Monsieur de Bois, when he had concluded his letter, found the art student at the bedside of Maurice. "I will post your letter, if you please," said Ronald. "Then I will make a moment's descent into the studio, or some of the noisy madcaps will be rushing here after me. I will return, however, before long, if you will have no objection." Hardly waiting for Monsieur de Bois' courteous but rather slowly expressed acknowledgment, he hurried away. For a couple of hours Gaston sat beside Maurice, listening to his indistinct ravings, but tracing out a striking likeness to a countenance he had studied too closely for his own peace. Now and then he exchanged a word or two with the good sister as she moistened the lips and bathed the brow of the sufferer. The doctor came, but pronounced his patient no better, and threw out a hint that he had some fears that the fever was taking the form of typhus, added a warning in regard to the danger of infection. That intelligence had no influence on Gaston, who resolved to pass as many hours as possible with his friend, nor did it affect Ronald Walton when he returned and heard the physician's verdict. The two young men for the next 4 days alternatively shared the duties with the Holy Sister. The postal arrangements between Paris and Rennes chanced at that moment to be very imperfect. The letter of Dr. Dupont never reached its destination, and that of Monsieur de Bois was delayed on its route. It was not until the 5th day after it was posted that Count Tristan, who obeyed the summons with all haste, arrived in Paris. His son had never once evinced sufficient consciousness to recognize Gaston Dubois, but the instant the Count was ushered into the room, was seized with a fit of frenzy, and broke forth in a torrent of reproaches, upbraided his father with the ruin and death of Madelaine, charged him with having wrought the destruction of his own son, and warned him that he brought utter desolation upon his ancestral home. Dr. Dupont, who entered the room during the paroxysm, suggested to the Count the propriety of withdrawing. The latter, although every word Maurice uttered inflicted a deadly pang, could not, at first, be induced to tear himself away. The doctor was resolute in pronouncing his sentence of banishment, and declared that the Vicomte's life might be the sacrifice if he were subjected to further excitement. We will not attempt to portray the poignant sufferings of the Count, who, in spite of his wiliness and worldliness, was passionately attached to his only child, the central axis upon which all his hopes, his schemes, his whole world moved. Several times while the invalid was sleeping, his father ventured to steal into the chamber, but by some strange species of magnetism, his very sphere seemed to affect the slumberer, who invariably woke and recognized or partially recognized him, and burst out anew in violent denunciations, to which respect would never have allowed him to give utterance, except under the stimulus of delirium. The Count writhed and shrank beneath the fierce stabbing of those incisive words, and, in his ungovernable grief, flung himself beside his son, whom he feared death would shortly snatch from his arms, pouring forth assurances Maurice would have hailed as words of life, but which now fell powerless upon his unheeding ears. While Count Tristan's overwhelming anguish lasted, there was no promise he would not have made to purchase his son's restoration, and no promise he would not have broken, if interest promised, when the peril was past. After one of these agitating interviews, the doctor's edict entirely closed the door of the patient's chamber against the Count, who was forced to admit the wisdom of the order. Gaston de Bois and Ronald Walton, between whom a pleasant intimacy was springing up, continued to watch by the bed of Maurice. Another fortnight passed, and though he lay, as it were, in a grave of fire, the doctor's prediction of typhus fever was not verified. At the expiration of this period, Ronald was the first to notice a favorable change, and to discover that the invalid had lucid intervals which showed his reason was reascending to her abdicated throne. But he abstained from pointing out the improvement to Gaston, fearing that, in his joy, he might communicate the consolatory intelligence to the Count, who would then insist upon seeing his son, and possibly reproduce the evil results by which his former visits had been attended. Maurice had ceased to moan and mutter, and lay motionless as one thoroughly exhausted. He slept much, waking but for a few moments, and sinking again into a species of half-lethargy. There was something inexpressibly sweet and pleasant in his present calmness. His mind seemed to have been mysteriously soothed and satisfied. The turbulent waves that dashed him hither and thither against the sharp rocks of doubt and fear had subsided. His features, especially when he slept, wore an expression of the most serene contentment. The Sieur Bonsecours, who had watched him through the night, had yielded her place to the sister, who assumed the office of nurse during the day. Gaston entered soon after, and, finding the patient gently slumbering, sat down beside his bed. After a time, Maurice stirred, drew a long breath, and slowly opened his eyes. They met those of his watcher. For some time the invalid gazed at him without speaking, and then said, in a tone that was hardly audible, "Monsieur de Bois." "My dear Maurice, dear friend, you are better, you know me at last," exclaimed Gaston joyfully. "I knew you before. You have been the most faithful of friends and nurses. I knew you quite well. I knew her, too." Gaston bounded from his chair, breathing so hard that he could scarcely stammer out, "Her? Whom do you mean?" "Madelaine," replied Maurice confidently. "Mademoiselle Madelaine, you are dreaming." "No, I thought so at first, and the dream was so sweet that I would not break it by word or motion, fearing that I would discover it was not reality. But it was no dream. Night after night, how many I do not know, I could not count, I have seen Madelaine beside me. When the good sister moved about the room in the dim light of the VIIIs, in spite of her coarse, unshapely garb, I recognized the outlines of Madelaine's form, notwithstanding the uncouth bonnet, the white bandage that concealed her hair and brow, and, passing beneath her chin, almost hid her face. I recognized the features of Madelaine. I watched her as she glided about the room, with her delicate, noiseless, rapidly moving touch, created the most perfect order around me. I heard her as she softly sang sweet anthems, and I could not mistake the voice of Madelaine. I felt her hand, her cool, fresh, velvety hand, my burning head, and it soothed me deliciously. I lay with my closed eyes as she bathed my temples and passed her fingers through my hair to loosen its tangles. I was afraid of frightening her away, or finding that I saw but a vision. The water she held to my lips was nectar. When she smoothed my pillow, all pain passed from my temples that rested upon it, throbbing with agony before, and I sank into a sweet slumber. Not unconscious slumber. I knew that I was sleeping. I knew that Madelaine sat there, filling the place of the Sister of Charity. I knew that when I opened my eyes I should see her, and I did, again and again. I never once spoke to her. I feared that some spell would be broken if I breathed her name. In the morning she disappeared, but I knew she would come again at midnight, when all was quiet, and the light was carefully shaded. Monsieur de Bois, my dear Gaston, I tell you, I have seen Madelaine." Monsieur de Bois sat still, looking too much astounded to utter a word. "I see you cannot believe me," Maurice continued. "She never came while you were here, and so you think it is a dream, a happy dream. A dream full of the balm of Gilead, for she cured me. My brain was a burning volcano until her hand was laid upon my brow, and I gazed in her face and knew it was no phantom.
Do not look so much distressed, my dear Gaston. I am perfectly in my senses." Monsieur de Bois did not contradict him. Perhaps he remembered the good rule of never opposing a sick man's vagaries. After a pause he said, "Maurice, since you are quite yourself, would you not like to see your father?" The wan face of Maurice flushed slightly. "Is he here?" "Yes, he has been here for more than a fortnight. The doctor forbade his entering. Will you not see him now?" The invalid assented languidly. He had perhaps spoken too much and overtaxed his strength. The joy of Count Tristan was deep and voiceless when he was once more permitted to embrace his son. He was so fearful of touching upon some painful chord, and of again hearing those frantic ravings, that he had no language at his command. Maurice, in a faint tone, inquired after his grandmother and Bertha, and then seemed too weary to prolong the conversation. Glad at heart, as the Count could not but feel, at the wonderful improvement in his son, he was ill at ease in his presence, and seemed always to have some haunting dread upon his mind. It was a relief when the doctor forbade his patient to converse, and hinted that the Count should make his visits very brief. The next day, when Monsieur de Bois entered, Maurice greeted him in a mournful tone. "She did not come last night. I watched for her in vain. The sister yonder went as usual at midnight and came back in the morning, but during the night a stranger took her place." What could Monsieur de Bois answer? He gave a sigh of sympathy, but did not attempt to make any comment. "She knows perhaps that my father is here, and she will come no more for fear of being discovered. But I have seen her, Gaston. I know I have seen her. I could not have lived if I had not. And her countenance was not sad. It wore a look of patient hope that lent a glory to her face. The very remembrance of that saint-like expression put to shame the despair to which I have yielded. I am—" Monsieur de Bois could not get any further. If he had meant to use any argument to persuade Maurice that it was only a vision conjured up by his fevered imagination which he had seen, the attempt would have been in vain. Maurice clung to the belief that he had really beheld Madelaine, and that conviction soothed, strengthened, and reanimated him. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 13. Weary Days. Up to this period of his life, the vigorous constitution of Maurice had suffered no exhausting drain. His habits had been so regular, his mode of life so simple, that his fine physique had been untrifled with, uninjured. As a natural sequence, the first inroads made upon his strength were rapidly repaired. The fever once conquered, in a week he was sufficiently convalescent to walk out, leaning on the arm of Gaston de Bois or Ronald Walton. His gait was feeble, his form attenuated, his countenance had lost its ruddy glow. The lines had sharpened until their youthful, healthful roundness was wholly obliterated, but the nervous, untranquil expression had passed from his face, and the restless glancing from side to side had left his eyes. Through the stimulating medium of fresh air and gentle exercise, he gained new vitality, and the promise of speedy restoration was daily confirmed. His favorite resort was the atelier of the celebrated master under whose direction Ronald was studying his art. Seated in the comfortable armchair devoted to the use of models, Maurice often remained for hours, watching the busy brushes and earnest faces, among which the genius-lighted countenance of the young Carolinian shone conspicuously. On one of these occasions, after sitting for some time lost in thought, when he chanced to turn his head, Ronald surprised him by crying out,
My dear fellow, don't move. Keep that position another moment, will you? I am making a sketch of your head. It is just the outline I want for my Saxon knight after the battle." Maurice could not but smile at this evidence of the national trait of the young American, who seized upon every material within his reach for the advancement of his art. Ronald's words, too, struck him. After the battle. Well might he resemble one who had passed through a severe conflict. But it was also one who was prepared to fight valiantly anew, and not disposed to succumb to the army of adverse circumstances arrayed against his peace. It was not possible for a young man, endowed with the impressible temperament of Maurice, to be thrown into constant communication with an associate as full of vigorous activity as Ronald Walton, without being stirred and inspired by the contact. The force, decision, aptitude, promptness, which distinguished Ronald, had constituted him a sort of prince among his fellow students, who gave him the lead in all their united movements, without defining to themselves his claim to supremacy. Ronald's character was not free from imperfections, but its very faults were essentially national, were characteristics of that fast-running nation which is indivertible in aim, and incredulous of the existence of the unattainable. His dominant failing was a self-dependence which in a weaker nature would have degenerated into self-sufficiency, but just stopped short of that complacent, puerile egotism which narrows the mind and rears its own opinions upon a judgment seat to pronounce verdicts upon the rest of the world. He never doubted his ability to scale any height upon which he fixed his eyes. He laughed at obstacles. He did not believe in impossibilities. What any other man could accomplish, that he had an eternal conviction he might also achieve. He held the faith of the poet queen that all men were possible heroes. These attributes were precisely those most calculated to impress and charm Maurice, and he regarded Ronald with the unbounded admiration mingled with a sickening sense of regret when he reflected upon the trammels which reined in the ready impulses and crushed the instinctive aspirations which were wrestling within himself. Count Tristan, as soon as his son was sufficiently restored to travel, suggested that he should return with him to Brittany, but Maurice betrayed such uncompromising reluctance to this proposal that his father thought it wise not to press the point. Though the Count had escaped a calamity which even to contemplate had almost driven him out of his mind, though his son's life was spared and his restoration to vigorous health assured, at times the father felt as if the son was lost to him forever. An inexplicable reserve had risen up and thrust them asunder. In the Count's presence Maurice was always abstracted and pensive. He uttered no complaints, made no petitions. He had come to the conclusion that both were useless, but his opinions and wishes were no longer frankly, boldly iterated. He and his father stood upon different platforms, with an invisible but insurmountable barrier looming up between them. Count Tristan, albeit irritated, galled, grieved, could discover no means of re-establishing the olden footing. After spending a month in Paris, he returned to Brittany, his mind filled with discomforting forebodings to which he could give no definite shape. Maurice was once more left in the great gay capital, his own master, at liberty to plunge into whatever sea of dissipation, to float idly down whatever tide of pleasure lured him. But he wronged himself when he warned his father, some months previous, that if he were debarred from studying a profession, he might seek excitement or oblivion in impure channels, and waste his exuberant energies in degrading pastimes. He spoke on the spur of some vague, restless impulse within him that clamored for an outlet, but he misjudged himself in imagining that he could be compelled to drown the memory of his disappointment in the wine-cup, the vortex of the gaming-table, or the more fearful maelstrom of siren allurements. To a young heart which has not been sullied by familiar contact with evil, there is no Aegeus so invulnerable to the assaults of those deadly enemies who make their attacks in the fascinating garb of licentious liberty as a strong, pure, life-absorbing attachment. He who wears the shield of a first stainless affection carries ethereal spear in his hand, and, at a single touch, the sensual enchanter in his path, however resplendent its disguise, drops the fair-featured mask and shining mantle, and stands revealed in native hideousness. The image of Madelaine, ever present to Maurice, drew around him a protecting circle which nothing vile could enter, and wherever his own eyes turned, it seemed to him that her heavenly eyes followed. Could he profane their holy gaze by fixing his upon scenes of captivating degradation and rose-crowned vice? Day after day, as his strength returned, it was but natural that he should grow more and more weary of monotonous indolence, and more impatient to escape from its depressing, deadening thraldom. The happy change which a settled occupation had effected in Gaston de Bois seemed to add to the discontent of his friend. Sometimes he was on the point of starting for Brittany and making a fresh appeal to his father. Then he was withheld by the dread that an angry discussion would be the only sequence. He knew that his father's pride, sustained by that of his grandmother, was unconquerable, and that the sentence which condemned him to a dreary, inert, and profitless existence would only be pronounced upon him anew. Since his illness, he had entirely abandoned his vain search for Madelaine. He always felt as though he had seen her, albeit when he attempted to reflect upon the likelihood that she had actually sat beside his couch and watched over him during his illness, reason essayed to efface the impression which could hardly have been made by the fingers of reality. Even granting that Madelaine, on leaving Brittany, had joined the sisterhood and proposed to devote her life to holy offices for which she was richly dowered by nature, was there not a novitiate to be passed? How could she so soon have entered upon her sacred duties? And if by some mysterious dispensation she had been absolved from the probation of a novice, how could she have learned that he was ill? How could she have come to him so promptly? Was it probable that Mr. Walton, an entire stranger, had, by mere accident, selected a nurse from the very society which she had joined? These questions, and others equally difficult to answer, sprang up constantly in his mind and found no satisfactory answer. Yet the conviction that he had actually beheld her remained unshaken. Bertha had been apprised by her aunt of the dangerous illness of Maurice, and had written to him when he was unable to read her letters. As soon as he was convalescent, they were placed in his hands. "My dear Gaston, write a line to my cousin for me," begged Maurice, feeling that he had not the strength to reply, and little dreaming what a thrill of joy ran through Gaston's frame at the request. Monsieur de Bois wrote, and wrote with such eloquence that never could have found utterance through his tongue. If we may judge from the number of times Bertha perused that letter, or if we may draw an inference from her wearing it about her person, probably that she might be able to refresh her memory with its information concerning her cousin, the epistle was either very difficult of comprehension, or it had some witching spell which drew her eyes irresistibly to its cabalistic characters. She had not recovered her wonted buoyancy. Beneath her uncle's roof, she pined for Madelaine hardly less than at the Chateau de Gramont. The Marquis de Merivale, her guardian, was a bachelor. The chief object of his existence was an endeavor to take life easy, and guard himself from all vexations and discomforts. His next aim was to pamper the cravings of an Epicurean appetite. but always with such judicious ministry that his digestive organs might not be impaired thereby. He was good-natured on principle, because it was too much trouble to get excited and vexed. His equanimity was seldom disturbed, save by his cook's failure in connection of a favorite dish. Count Tristan had drawn largely on his invention when he informed the Marchioness de Fleury that Bertha's uncle was exceedingly tenacious of his rights, and jealous of the interference of his niece's relatives in regard to any future alliance she might form. The Marquis never dreamed of troubling his brain with such a minor matter as matrimony. He was inclined to be governed entirely by Bertha's predilection, to leave the affair wholly to her, throwing off the trouble with the responsibility. He could have no objection to see her affianced to the Duc de Montauban. He would have none to her union with Maurice de Gramont. He found it sufficient pleasure to have his bright-faced niece sitting opposite him at table, so long as she was gay and had a good appetite. If he had thwarted her wishes, he would have accused himself of making a base, unkingly attempt to injure her digestion by causing her annoyance. He considered himself quite incapable of so unworthy, so harmful, so cruel an action. When she returned from the Château de Gramont, he was discomposed at finding that she brought back a clouded visage, and seemed perfectly indifferent to the choicest dainties which he caused to be set before her as the most striking mark of his affection. Indeed, he became so uncomfortable when she rejected these delicate attentions day after day that his mind was gradually prepared to look favorably upon a proposition which Bertha had resolved to make. She had been at home about a month. They were dining, that is, her uncle was enjoying partaking of the meal that rounded his day, while Bertha's fork played with the oyster pâté on her plate, dividing it into tiny bits, but never lifting one to her mouth. The Marquis, after descanting warmly upon the excellence of the pâté, which he highly relished, interrupted his eulogium by saying, "My dear child, you have not tasted a morsel of this incomparable pâté. It is a triumph of the culinary art. If you will just oblige me by touching a small piece to your lips. The paste is so light it will magically melt. Really, you must eat." "I cannot, uncle." Try. It disturbs me greatly to see you sitting there looking so gloomy. It will really hurt my digestion, and that would be a frightful calamity. Don't you like Lucien's cooking? I think him a treasure. But if you cannot relish what he prepares, he shall receive his dismissal." "I dare say I should like the cooking in Paris better than any other," remarked Bertha, treacherously assailing her uncle in his vulnerable point. "Paris? What are you talking about? We cannot have our dinners sent from Paris and kept warm on the road, can we?" "But we might go to Paris and take our dinners," she rejoined coaxingly. "Bless my heart, what an idea! It's a day's journey. Think of the trouble and discomfort of getting there. Think of the new inventions of Parisian cuisine, for they invent new dishes, and my cousin Maurice has told me as often as they originate new fashions for dress. There are abundance of novel dishes every day issuing from the brains of accomplished cooks, dishes of which you have never heard, and really ought to taste some of them." "That's a consideration. It positively is. I must reflect upon it," replied her uncle. "And Maurice seems to cling to the idea that my cousin Madelaine," continued Bertha.
There, my dear, that will do. Don't touch upon that unpleasant subject, especially at dinner. It will certainly injure your digestive organs and give you the blues for the rest of the day. I assure you, my child, all low spirits come from indigestion. I am convinced that indigestion is the great cause of all the sadness and sorrow, and I dare say of all the sin in the world. It seems to me a change of air must be very beneficial, replied Bertha, recovering from the false step she had been on the point of making. Very wisely remarked. Change of air is beneficial, and gentle exercise is beneficial. Both stimulate the digestive faculties and keep their healthy action. And you really think, my dear, you would like to taste some of those new Parisian dishes? I should indeed. Then you shall. I look upon it as criminal in the present low state of your appetite to thwart its faintest craving. Of course, we cannot procure anything fit to sustain nature on the road to Paris, but I can make Pierre pack up a basket of refreshments and a bottle of old wine, so that we shall not be poisoned on the way, if we can only make the journey comfortably. I have no objection to investigate the gastronomic novelties of which you have heard. We could take Lucien with us, that he might learn some of the new mysteries in his art. Oh, to be sure you could. When shall we start, uncle dear? I am so anxious to go. When shall we start? There, don't get excited about it. That will interfere with the gastric juices. Let us conclude our dinner quietly. Try a wing of that pheasant while we discuss the matter with wholesome calmness. Bertha allowed herself to be helped to the wing, and tried to force down a few morsels for the sake of humoring the generously inclined bon vivant, who grew more and more genial and amiably disposed as he sipped his Chateau Margaux. Fine wine invariably had a softening, expansive effect upon his character, and, after a few glasses, he honestly looked upon himself as one of the most tender-hearted, soberly inoffensive, and morally disposed of mortals. If Bertha had openly proposed to him that they should spend a few weeks in Paris for the gratification of any praiseworthy intention of her own, or of any harmless whim, he would have unhesitatingly refused and opposed any number of objections to the proposition, but she had introduced the subject in its most favorable light, and was sure of a victory. A few days later, the Marquis de Merivale and his niece, attended by her maid, his valet and cook, were on their way to the metropolis. The Marquis, having instituted many inquiries with a view of discovering what hotel rejoiced in the possession of the most scientific cook, concluded to engage a suite of apartments at the Hotel des Trois Empereurs. The meeting between Bertha and Maurice was as full of tenderness as though they had been in reality what their strong family resemblance caused them to appear, brother and sister. "No word from Madelaine yet?" was Bertha's first inquiry, hardly an inquiry, for she knew what the answer must be. Maurice told her of the Sieur de Bonsecours, who had sat by his bed night after night. "Could it really have been Madelaine?" she asked breathlessly. Monsieur Dubois seems to think not, yet I am unshaken in my conviction that it was she herself. "But why did you not speak to her?" "A feeling that I can scarcely define withheld me. At first I thought I was dreaming, and that the dream would have been broken if I spoke or moved. Then I felt sure Madelaine was there, but that she believed herself unrecognized, and if I showed that I knew her she would leave me when I could not follow, and must again have lost all trace of her. It was such a luxury,
Such a joy to feel her by my side. It was her presence, and not the skill of the physician, which restored me."
"And you never betrayed yourself?"
"No. What seems most singular is that from the very day I mentioned to Monsieur Dubois that I had seen her, she came no more. Yet how could she have learned or divined that I knew her?"
"That circumstance, my dear Maurice, makes it all look like a dream. As soon as the fever left you, the phantom it conjured up disappeared."
Maurice shook his head, unconvinced, and Bertha was too willing to be deceived herself to attempt to persuade him that he was in error. The Marquis de Merivale now entered. Maurice, whom he had only known slightly, rose in favor when the epicure found that the young Parisienne could give all requisite information concerning the best restaurant in Paris, and the Vicomte reached a higher summit of esteem when he promptly promised to put Lucien en train to familiarize himself with the certain valuable culinary discoveries. Maurice knew enough of the character of the Marquis to be confident that his stay in the metropolis would be determined by the amount of comfort he enjoyed and the quality of the dinners set before him. Bertha's next visit was from Monsieur Dubois, and could she have banished from her mind a vague impression that he loved Madelaine, or was beloved by her, the interview would have afforded her unmitigated happiness. Monsieur Dubois had not yet gained sufficient mastery over himself to command his utterance in the presence of the woman who had most power to confuse him. He still stammered painfully, but he could not help remarking that, even as Madelaine had said, Bertha finished his broken sentences, apparently unaware that she was doing so, and her greeting, surely it had been far from cold. And did she not say, with soft emphasis, which it almost took his breath to hear, that it seemed an age since they had met? Had she then felt the time long? And did she not drop some involuntary remark concerning the dullness of Ritchie after he and Maurice left? Had she not coupled him with her cousin? Might he not dare to believe that Madelaine was right, and Bertha certainly did not scorn him? End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 14. Diamonds and Emeralds.
"I wish you would go, Maurice. Do, for my sake,"
pleaded Bertha, twisting in her slender fingers a note of invitation.
"The Marquis de Fleury was one of the first persons who called upon my uncle, and he made a very favourable impression. Then Madame de Fleury has nearly crushed me beneath an avalanche of sweet civilities. I fancy that a hummingbird drowned in honey must experience sensations very similar to mine in her presence. Is it not the Chinese who serve as the greatest of delicacies a lump of ice rolled in hot pastries? The condiment with which she feeds my vanity reminds me of this singular and paradoxical dainty. If you penetrate the warm, sugared outer crust, you find ice within. But as my uncle does not anticipate Chinese diet at the table of the Marchioness, he desires me to accept her invitation, and as you are invited, I wish you to do the same, that I may have some familiar face near me."
"Gaston Dubois will be there," returned Maurice, "and so will the young American student, Ronald Walton, whom I presented to you. They are my dearest friends. Pray let them represent me, little cousin." But Bertha was obstinate. Her character had a strong tincture of wilfulness. the result of invariably having her pleasure consulted, and always obtained her own way. She did not relinquish her entreaties until Maurice, who had not lived long enough to be skilled in the art of successfully denying the petition of a person who will take no refusal, or of plucking the waspish sting out of no, consented to be present at the dinner. The Marquis de Fleury had learned, through his secretary, that Mademoiselle Melanie and her guardian were in Paris, though the matrimonial proposition of the Marchioness on behalf of her brother, the Duc de Montauban, had been so unfavourably received by Bertha's relatives in Brittany, and though Bertha herself, when she met the Duke at the Chateau de Trémousson, had treated him somewhat coldly, the young Duke was too much enamoured of the fair girl herself, to say nothing of a tender leaning towards her attractive fortune, to be discouraged by a passing rebuff. His relatives hailed the anticipated opportunity of making the acquaintance of Bertha's guardian, and were prompt in paying their devoirs. An invitation to dine followed quickly on the footsteps of the visit. We pass over the days that preceded the one appointed for the dinner party. They were unmarked by incidents which demand to be recorded. The bond of intimacy between Ronald and Maurice was drawn closer and closer each day. Little by little the latter had communicated the history of his own trials, his father's determined opposition to his embracing a professional career, his attachment to Madelaine, her unaccountable rejection of his hand, her sudden disappearance, and the mad pursuit, which terminated by casting him insensible at Ronald's door, and brought to his succour one who not only watched beside him with all the devotion of a brother, mingled with the tenderness of womanhood itself, but whose buoyant, healthy tone of mind had infused new hope and vigour into a broken, despondent, prostrate spirit. Ronald Walton was placed in an advantageous position in Paris by the very fact of being an American. His intellect, talent, manners, person, fitted him to grace the most refined society, and, coming from a land where distinctions of rank are not arbitrarily governed by accident of birth, but where men are assigned their positions in the social scale through a juster, higher, more liberal verdict, the young Carolinian gained facile admission into the most exclusive circles abroad, and even took precedence of individuals who made as loud a boast of noble blood and hereditary titles as though the concentrated virtues of all their ancestors had been transmitted to them through these dubious mediums. Ronald, as the intimate friend of Maurice de Gramont, had received an invitation to the dinner given by the Marchioness de Fleury to the relatives of the Vicomte. The young men entered Madame de Fleury's drawing-room together, and, after having basked for a few seconds in smiles of meridian radiance, and being inundated by a flood of softly syllabled words, moved away to let the beams of their sunny hostess fall upon newcomers. Maurice glanced around the room in search of his cousin. "She has just entered the antechamber," said Ronald, comprehending his look. "Her Hebe-like face this minute flashed upon me." While he was speaking, Bertha and her uncle were announced, and advanced towards their hostess. The low genuflection of the Marchioness had been responded to by Bertha's unstudied curtsy, and the lips of the young girl had just parted to speak when she suddenly gave a violent start and uttered a cry as sharp and involuntary as though she had trodden upon some piercing instrument. As she tottered back, her dilated eyes were fixed upon Madame de Fleury in a blank amazement. "What is it, my dear? Are you ill?" asked her uncle with deep concern. Bertha did not reply, but still gazed at the Marchioness, or rather her eyes ran over the lady's toilette, as she clung to her uncle's arm as though unable to support herself. "I am afraid that you really are ill," continued the Marquis de Merivale.
Something has disagreed with you. It must have been the truffles with which that pheasant we had for déjeuner was stuffed. I toyed with them very timidly myself." "Pray sit down, my dear Mademoiselle de Merivale," said Madame de Fleury, leading her to a chair which stood near. "Sit down while I order you a glass of water." She turned to address a servant, but Bertha stretched out her hand, almost as though she feared she might lose sight of her. Don't go. Let me look. Can they be hers? Let me look again." Madame de Fleury, as unruffled as though these broken exclamations were perfectly natural and comprehensible, bent over Bertha caressingly, laying the tips of her delicately gloved fingers on her shoulder. Bertha wistfully examined the bracelet on the lady's arm, and fixed her eyes upon the necklace, brooch, and earrings, and lastly upon the tiara-like comb, about which the hair of the Marchioness was arranged in a dexterous and novel manner. Madame de Fleury was gratified, without being moved by the faintest surprise that her toilette had produced such an overpowering sensation. Bertha's emotion did not appear to her in the least misplaced or exaggerated. "You admire this set of diamonds and emeralds very much, then," she said complacently. "The fleur-de-lis and shamrock," faltered Bertha. Where did they come from?" Interpreting this unceremonious abruptness and singularity of the question into a spontaneous tribute paid to her costly ornaments, the Marchioness graciously answered, "This parure was a delicate attention from Monsieur de Fleury. Not long after he presented these diamonds to me, by a very strange coincidence, VIII sent this dress for my approval. You observe how dexterously the device of the necklace is imitated. Can anything be more perfect than these lilies and shamrock leaves?" Bertha hastily glanced at the rich white silk robe, trimmed with the revers of pale velvet, upon which the lilies and shamrock were embroidered with some species of lustrous thread, which counterfeited not only the design, but the sparkle of the gems. The Marchioness went on. "Was it not odd that Vignon, famed as she is for novelties, should have chanced upon a dress which so exactly matched my new set? It quite makes me a convert to the science of animal magnetism. My mind, you see, was en rapport with hers. Indeed, she says so herself, for she could not otherwise explain the sudden inspiration which caused her to plan this trimming. Monsieur de Fleury wanted me to have these jewels set anew, but I would not allow them to be touched. This old-fashioned setting is so remarkable, so unique. Probably there is not another like it to be found in Paris. That is always vantage ground gained over one's jewel-wearing adversaries." The Marchioness, once launched upon her favourite stream of talk, would have sailed on interminably, had not the announcement of new guests floated her upon another current. "I hope the spasms are going over, said the Marquis de Merivale, who was really distressed by Bertha's supposed illness. "It was very clever to divert observation by talking about dresses and jewels, but the truffles did the mischief. I knew well enough what was the matter with you." No, it was the jewels," replied Bertha, who had not yet recovered her self-possession. "Those diamonds and emeralds were Madelaine's." "Madelaine's!" ejaculated Maurice, who had approached her on witnessing her unaccountable agitation. "Good heavens, is it possible?" "Yes, they were Madelaine's. They were her mother's jewels, and had been in her family for generations. Madelaine showed them to me only a few nights before she left the Chateau de Gramont. I am sure of them. I would have recognized them anywhere." Then, at last, At last, oh, thank God, we shall trace her. She must have sold those jewels for her support. We must find from whence Madame de Fleury purchased them," returned Maurice, with a voice trembling with exultation. "Madame de Fleury said they were a cadeau from the Marquis," replied Bertha. "Come, let us find him. Let us ask him at once." Bertha rose with animation and took her uncle's arm. "Where are we going, my dear? Pray do not excite yourself again," pleaded her solicitous guardian. "Pray keep cool. Dinner must shortly be served, and you will not be in a fit state to do justice to the sumptuous repast which I have no doubt awaits us. Some of those novel inventions, perhaps, which you were so anxious to taste. I see people are not scrupulously punctual in Paris. It is 10 minutes after time. Possibly we are waiting for some guest who has not sufficiently good taste to remember that viands may be overdone through his culpability." "I must speak to Monsieur de Fleury," said Bertha. "Let us get nearer to him, that I may seize the first opportunity when he ceases talking to that pompous-looking old gentleman who has the left breast of his coat covered with decorations." Well, take it quietly. Keep cool. Don't let your blood into a ferment. That's all I ask." Her uncle led her across the room, accompanied by Maurice. Diplomat and courtier were inscribed on every line of the wrinkled countenance of the Marquis de Fleury. He never took a step or gave a look, or scarcely drew a breath, by which he had not some object to accomplish, some interest to promote. An oppressive suavity of manner, an exaggerated politeness encased him in impenetrable armor, and prevented the real man from ever being reached beneath his smooth surface. Impulses he had none. The slightest motions of his wiry frame were studied. When he walked, he slid along as though he could not be guilty of so positive an action as that of planting his feet firmly upon what might prove delicate ground. When he bowed, a contraction of the sinews worthy of an acrobat allowed his head to obtain an unnatural inclination, suggestive of complimentary deference, which humbled itself to dust, and kissed the garment's hem. Straightforwardness in word, thought, or action was to him as incomprehensible as it was impossible. He was a great general, ever standing on the political or social battlefield. Skilful maneuvers were the glory of his existence, and flattery the magical weapon never laid aside by which he gained his victories. Madame de Fleury was 30 years his junior. He had purposefully selected a young, pretty, harmless, well-dressed doll as the being best suited to further his ends in the great world. He admired her sincerely. She reached the exact mental stature and standard which he looked upon as perfection in womanhood, and her absolute despotism in ruling the modes and creeds of the beau monde were to him the highest proof of her superiority over the rest of her sex. Though he was engaged in conversation with the Emperor's Grand Chamberlain, which seemed deeply interesting to both parties, Monsieur de Fleury broke off instantly when Bertha, with her uncle and Maurice, approached. "You are so radiant tonight, Mademoiselle de Merveille," remarked the courtier, "that all eyes are fixed upon you. It is cruel of you to dazzle the vision of so many admirers." Bertha, without paying the slightest attention to these fulsome words, replied, "Will you pardon me, Monsieur de Fleury, if I ask an impertinent question? How could any question from so sovereign lips become other than condescension? The Queen of Beauty commands in advance a reply to the most difficult problem which she can propound."
Bertha, with an impatient toss of her head, as though the buzz of this nonsensical verbiage stung her ears, plunged at once into the subject.
That set of diamonds and emeralds which Madame de Fleury wears tonight were presented to her by you. Will you have the goodness to tell me from whence you procured them?
For Monsieur de Fleury to have given a direct answer, even in relation to such an apparent trifle, would have been contrary to his nature. Besides, it was one of his rules not to impart information without learning for what object it had been sought. "You admire them?" he replied evasively. "I am delighted. I am charmed with your approval of my taste. I shall think more highly of it for ever after. The setting of the jewels is old-fashioned, but Madame de Fleury found it so novel that I could not prevail upon her to have it modernized."
"But you have not told me how the jewels came into your possession."
"Oh, very naturally, lovely lady. They were not a fairy gift. They became mine by the very prosaic transaction of purchase." Maurice could restrain himself no longer. "My cousin is particularly desirous of learning through what source you obtained them. She has an important reason for her inquiry." This explanation only placed the Marquis more on his guard. "Ah, your captivating cousin thinks they look as though they had a history. Yes, jewels of that kind generally have. Does the design strike you as remarkable, Mademoiselle de Merivale?"
"Yes, remarkable, and I have seen it before. I could not forget it. I wish to know—"
Dinner was announced at that moment. The Duke de Montauban came forward and offered his arm to Bertha. Monsieur de Fleury, with lavish apologies for the interruption of conversation which he pronounced delightful, begged the Marquis de Merivale to give his arm to Madame de Fleury, named to Maurice a young lady whom he would have the goodness to conduct, glided about the room to give similar instructions to other gentlemen, and, selecting an elderly lady who was evidently a person of distinction, led the way to the dining-room. Maurice stood still, looking perplexed and abstracted, and quite forgetting that he had any ceremonious duty to perform. Ronald, whom from the time he had watched beside the Vicomte's sick-bed had not relinquished his friendly surveillance, noticed his absence of mind, and, as he passed him, whispered, "My dear fellow, what's the matter? You are dreaming again. Rouse yourself. Some young lady must be waiting for your arm." "Ronald," exclaimed Maurice, "something very singular has happened. Madame de Fleury is wearing Madelaine's family jewels." "Bravo! That is cheering news indeed. You will certainly be able to trace her now, never fear. But you must get through this dinner first, so pray collect your scattered senses as expeditiously as possible." Elated by these words of encouragement, and the hilarious tone in which they were uttered, Maurice shook off his musing mood, and proffered his arm to the niece of Madame de Fleury, whom now he remembered that the Marquis had desired him to conduct. During the dinner this young lady pronounced the handsome cavalier, who had been assigned to her, tantalizingly distrait, and secretly wished that the artistic maître d'hôtel of her aunt had decorated the table with a less novel and attractive central ornament, for it seemed to her that the eyes of Maurice were constantly turned upon the miniature cherry-tree, of forest hothouse growth, that rose from a mossy mound in the centre of the festive board. The diminutive tree was covered with superb fruit, girdled by a circle of Lilliputian grapevines, each separate vine trained upon a golden rod, and heavily laden with luscious grapes, bunches of the clearest amber alternating with the deepest purple and richest crimson. Among the mosses of the mound were scattered the rarest products of the most opposite seasons, those of the present season being too natural to pamper the artificial taste of luxury. Truly, the arrangement was a charming exemplification of nature, made subservient to art, But was it this magnet to which the eyes of Maurice were so irresistibly attracted? He chanced to be seated where his view of the hostess was partially intercepted by the hothouse wonder, and he was seeking in vain to catch a glimpse of those jewels which had been Madelaine's. Bertha was placed nearer the Marchioness, and the Duc de Montauban could not help noticing that her gaze was frequently fixed upon his sister. But, being one of those men who are thoroughly convinced that what the French term chiffons is the most important interest of a woman's life, he consoled himself with the reflection that Mademoiselle de Merivale was deeply engrossed by a contemplation of Madame de Fleury's elaborate toilette, and that her absent manner had this very feminine, reasonable, and altogether to be tolerated apology. When Madame de Fleury and her guests swept back into the drawing-room, Monsieur de Fleury and the Grand Chamberlain were again closely engaged in some political battle. Maurice, after waiting impatiently for a favourable moment when he might come between the wordy belligerents, whispered to Ronald, "I am tortured to death. I shall never get an opportunity to ask the Marquis about those jewels. My cousin was questioning him on the subject when dinner was announced, but he seemed to treat her inquiries as of so little importance that she was quite baffled in obtaining information." "Why not attack him in a straightforward manner?" answered the positive young American. "Walk up and plainly ask for a few moments' private conversation. Give him the reason of your inquiries and demand an answer. Bring him to the point without any fancy fencing about the subject." "I fear it will look very strange," replied Maurice, hesitating. "What matter? Are you afraid of looking strange when you have a worthy object to accomplish? The information you need is of more importance than mere looks. It thoroughly amazes me to see the awe in which a genuine Parisian is held by the dread of appearing singular. One would imagine that all originality was felony, and that to catch the same key note of voice, to move with the exact motion, and tread in the precise footprints in which everyone else speaks, moves, walks, was the only evidence of honesty. What is a man's individuality worth if it is to be trodden out in the treadmill tramp of senseless conventionality?" Maurice glanced at his friend admiringly. He had observed on more than one occasion that although Ronald was thoroughly versed in all the nicest rules of etiquette, he had a way of breaking through them at his pleasure, and always so gracefully that his waiving of ceremony could never be set down to ignorance or ill-breeding. The Vicomte literally and without delay followed his friend's advice, and soon succeeded in drawing Monsieur de Fleury aside. "Permit me to explain to you Mademoiselle de Merivale's anxiety about those jewels," said Maurice. "You have, perhaps, heard the name of Mademoiselle Madelaine de Gramont, my cousin on my father's side. Some 6 weeks ago she suddenly left the Chateau de Gramont, and has not communicated with her family since. Those jewels were hers. She must have sold them. We are exceedingly anxious to discover her present residence and to induce her to return to my grandmother's protection. If you could inform me from whence those jewels came, it would facilitate my search." The Marquis had no definite motive for concealment beyond the dictates of his habitual caution. This explanation satisfied him in regard to the reasons which prompted inquiry, and, being desirous of getting rid of Maurice and of resuming the conversation he had interrupted, replied, with an assumption of cordiality, "It gives me great pleasure to be the medium of rendering the slightest service to your illustrious family. Those diamonds were brought to me by the Jew Enrique, from whom I now and then make purchases. I did not inquire in what manner they came into his possession, but not intending to be cheated as to their precise worth, I had them taken to Kramer in the Rue Neuve de Saint-Augustin, and a value placed upon them. I paid Henrique the price those trustworthy jewelers suggested instead of the exorbitant one he demanded. This is all the information I am able to afford you on the subject. May I beg you to favor me with the address of this Henrique? Certainly, with pleasure, but I warn you that you will not get much out of him. He is the closest Israelite imaginable, and a golden ointment is the only open sesame to his lips. Monsieur de Fleury wrote Henrique's street and number on his card and handed it to Maurice. Meanwhile, Gaston de Bois, in spite of the pertinacious attentions of the Duc de Montauban, had approached Bertha, and would have drawn her into conversation had she not exultingly communicated to him the discovery she had made concerning Madelaine's jewels. Was it the sudden mention of that name which threw Monsieur de Bois into a state of almost uncontrollable agitation? Why did he flush and stammer and try to change the subject, and, stumbling with suppressed groans over his words as though they had been sharp rocks, talk such unmitigated nonsense? Why did he so soon steal away from Bertha's side? Why did he not approach her again for the rest of the evening? Could it be that her first suspicion was right, and that he loved Madelaine? If not, why should her name again cause him such unaccountable emotion? End of chapter 14.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and click on the bell to turn on notifications.